Welcome back to Background Historian. Tonight, we begin a quiet and restful journey into the world of the Napoleonic era, a time filled with vast landscapes, shifting alliances, and the slow, monumental rise of a figure who shaped the destiny of nations. Rather than focusing on noise or conflict, this series invites you to drift peacefully through the gentle rhythms beneath the surface of history. We will explore the Napoleonic Wars through soft reflections. The lives of ordinary people, the quiet tension in European villages, the dim glow of campfires on distant fields, and the subtle turning of political tides. As we move through each part, let the calm storytelling guide your mind into stillness while offering a soothing understanding of one of history's great chapters. Part 1. A quiet Europe before the storm, the world on the eve of the Napoleonic Wars. Before the Napoleonic Wars began reshaping the world, Europe existed in a fragile and almost deceptive calm. The year was nearing the close of the 18th century, and across the continent, life followed familiar patterns. Fields were plowed at the same slow pace that generations had used before. Markets bustled in small towns where merchants sold cloth, spices, metal goods, and bread. Children played in courtyards, running past stone fountains that had trickled the same water for centuries. On the surface, Europe appeared peaceful. Yet beneath this gentle routine, quiet tension stirred in ways that most ordinary people could feel but could not fully name. Imagine yourself wandering through a peaceful French village in the late 1790s. The houses are simple, made of stone and timber, with smoke rising gently from chimneys as the evening meal simmers over the fire. People gather around wooden tables to share bread, cheese, and wine. They speak of harvests, marriages, and small-town gossip. But you might notice the worried looks exchanged between older villagers, the way conversations grow quieter whenever someone mentions Paris. Even in the countryside, the echo of the French Revolution lingers. It is felt in the changes to taxes, the shifts in local power, and the subtle fear that something new and uncertain is coming. Far from these quiet villages, Europe's capitals simmer with diplomatic tension. In London, Vienna, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Madrid, the ministers who guide empires shuffle papers late into the night. Their quills scratch anxiously across parchment as they compose letters warning of France's unpredictable government. Every week seems to bring new rumors about political upheaval, military reforms, and ambitious young generals rising out of chaos. Among those generals is one who captures attention even before most people know his name. Napoleon Bonaparte has already led daring campaigns in Italy, and whispers of his brilliance travel along the same trade routes that carry wine, grains, and fabrics. Merchants discuss him in taverns. Diplomats discuss him in candlelit halls. Villagers hear his name during festival gatherings or in letters from relatives serving in the army. Few understand the future that awaits, but many sense that Europe is approaching a turning point. To truly settle into the quiet world before the Napoleonic Wars, imagine a series of scenes unfolding gently one after another. First, picture the farms of Central Europe. Wheat fields stretch toward the horizon. Oxen pull wooden plows that lift rich soil into slow, steady furrows. Farmers pause to wipe sweat from their brows, unaware that in only a few years, these fields will see the passage of marching armies, artillery wagons, and cavalry regiments. Now picture the bustling streets of Vienna. Carriages roll over cobblestones. Street musicians play violins as vendors sell roasted nuts and pastries. The city feels safe behind its strong walls and old traditions. Yet in the royal palace, advisors exchange worried glances. They fear that the spread of revolutionary ideals from France might weaken the monarchy. They fear, even more, that France's new leaders have found a commander who can transform ideas into action. Travel now to London. The Thames reflects the glow of lanterns as ships glide silently through the water. Sailors unload crates of goods from distant corners of the world. England feels powerful and secure, guarded by its navy and its distance from the continent. Still, members of Parliament argue heatedly about whether France's restlessness will spill across the Channel. Newspapers print stories each morning about French movements, some true, many exaggerated. People gather in taverns to read aloud and speculate. Move farther north and picture the palaces of St. Petersburg. Snow blankets the ground. The air is crisp, and the Neva River is beginning to freeze. Russian nobles in fur-lined coats attend glittering winter balls, where chandeliers illuminate waltzing couples. Yet even amid the elegance, political conversations are tinged with unease. Russia keeps a wary eye on France, uncertain whether alliances should be built or whether armies should be raised. Meanwhile, in Spain and Italy, life moves in old rhythms shaped by centuries of tradition. Fishermen repair nets on Mediterranean shores. Monks walk along monastery gardens at dawn. Market vendors arrange spices, olives, and woven cloth in tidy rows. These lands will soon become battlegrounds and strategic prizes, but for now, peace rests softly over them. As you imagine these places, allow yourself to feel the gentle murmurs beneath the stillness. Europe is resting, but not deeply. The continent is like a vast lake whose surface appears calm, while unseen currents swirl below. In France, Napoleon's rise is beginning to take shape. He is still young and energetic, filled with ideas and ambition. His early victories have earned him admiration among soldiers and suspicion among politicians. He walks through military camps with quick steps, inspecting artillery, observing drills, and talking to rank-and-file soldiers with surprising familiarity. They love him for his clarity, his charisma, and his ability to inspire. In their conversations around campfires, they say that he sees what others do not see, that he knows how to keep them alive, that he cares for them as men rather than as numbers. These soldiers do not yet understand that they are standing at the edge of a long and difficult journey. They only know that their young commander possesses something rare and unforgettable. Even before the campaigns that will carve his name into history, Napoleon radiates a sense of purpose that draws people toward him. At the same time, ordinary families across Europe prepare for winters, for harvests, for marriages, and for festivals. They have no idea that their lives will soon be intertwined with the ambitions of a single man and the shifting alliances of kings and emperors. They go about their routines, unaware of the vast movements forming around them. The calm of the continent is like the soft air before a distant storm. Not a violent storm in a frightening sense, but a slow and enormous transformation that will reshape borders, governments, economies, and the lives of millions. The storm is not here yet. For now, Europe inhales slowly, preparing for the decades ahead. Allow yourself to rest in this moment. The world is poised between the quiet of the old age and the awakening of a new era. History stands at the threshold, waiting gently. In Part 2, we will explore Napoleon's early life and the experiences that shaped his remarkable mind, long before he became a name known across Europe. Part 2. The Forming of a Mind, Napoleon's Early Life on the Island of Corsica. To understand the vast sweep of the Napoleonic Wars, it is helpful to begin with something small and quiet. Before the campaigns, before the crowns, before the treaties and battles that shaped an age, there was a young boy growing up on a rugged island in the Mediterranean. His world was not filled with empires but with villages, wind-etched mountains, and the rhythm of a family trying to navigate a turbulent time. This is the early life of Napoleon Bonaparte, long before his name carried weight across Europe. Imagine the island of Corsica in the mid-18th century. It is a land of stone terraces, olive groves, and jagged coastlines shaped by centuries of wind and salt. The mountains rise steeply from the sea, their slopes dotted with small villages made of pale stone. Life is simple and tied closely to the earth. Shepherds guide flocks across rocky hillsides. Children run along narrow paths, their voices echoing through the valleys. Meals are shared in modest homes where smoke drifts through small chimneys and the scent of roasting chestnuts fills the air. Into this landscape, in August of 1769, Napoleon was born. His family was neither wealthy nor poor. They belonged to the island's lower nobility, a class respected in Corsican society but not powerful in the greater European world. The Bonapartes lived modestly, relying on local farming, small property holdings, and the careful management of family connections. His mother, Letizia, was known for her strength and quiet resilience. His father, Carlo, had an earnest interest in politics and the shifting tides of influence that moved across the Mediterranean. Corsica itself had only recently fallen under French control. For many years it had resisted foreign rule, and the memory of struggle lived strongly in the hearts of the island's people. Napoleon grew up hearing stories of resistance, pride, and independence. These early tales shaped his imagination, filling it with ideas about leadership, identity, and the will of a single determined person. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the cicadas quieted their song, he listened to older relatives describe the bravery of Corsican fighters and the importance of loyalty to family and homeland. As a boy, Napoleon was not the towering figure history remembers. He was small, sometimes moody, but intensely intelligent. He spent long hours reading or walking alone through hillsides that overlooked the sea. There was something reflective about him even at a young age. Teachers noticed his unusual focus, his ability to concentrate on tasks that other children found dull. He excelled in mathematics. He learned French slowly, speaking it with a Corsican accent throughout his life, but he mastered numbers and analysis quickly. These skills, though simple in childhood, would later become parts of the disciplined mind that organized entire campaigns. Napoleon's relationship with his family was marked by warmth and strong bonds. Letizia guided her children with strict but loving discipline. She raised her sons and daughters through years of economic uncertainty, teaching them thrift, patience, and resilience. Carlo worked to secure better opportunities for his children, eventually identifying education as the key to their future. It was through his efforts that Napoleon received a scholarship to study in mainland France, a decision that would change the course of his life. Before that departure, imagine the boy wandering through the streets of Ajaccio, the town where he grew up. The sound of waves crashing against the shore. The smell of pine trees warmed by the Mediterranean sun. The laughter of siblings drifting through the house. These memories stayed with him for the rest of his life, even during the years when he commanded thousands of soldiers on distant fields. Corsica remained the center of his early identity, something he carried within him through all the transformations of adulthood. At the age of 9, he left his island home to begin schooling on the French mainland. The journey itself must have felt overwhelming. The ship that carried him sliced across the water, leaving the familiar outline of Corsica behind. For a boy who had rarely traveled far from his village, the vastness of the sea and the uncertainty of what lay ahead created a quiet unease. Yet there was also curiosity. Napoleon had already developed a strong sense of ambition, though he did not yet understand what form it would take. Upon arriving in France, he entered a world drastically different from the rustic landscapes of Corsica. France was a powerful kingdom with refined manners, large cities, and a complex society divided into estates. Napoleon soon discovered that many students viewed him as an outsider. His accent marked him as foreign. His modest clothing set him apart from sons of wealthy families. These early experiences left him feeling isolated, but they also strengthened his determination. Instead of retreating, he immersed himself in study. He spent long hours reading history, particularly Roman history. He admired strong leaders of the ancient world and imagined himself navigating challenges with similar clarity and resolve. His schooling eventually led him to the military academy at Brienne. This place, more than any other during his youth, shaped the future commander he would become. Brienne was quiet and disciplined. Snow covered the grounds in winter, and the tall trees surrounding the school created a hushed atmosphere. Students marched, studied, and drilled beneath cold skies. Napoleon learned not only academic subjects but also the foundations of military life. He trained with weapons, practiced formation drills, and studied strategy. Even here, he remained something of an outsider. Yet this distance gave him time to observe others carefully. He learned how people behaved under stress, how groups formed, and how leadership functioned at different levels. These lessons were subtle, gathered through patient observation rather than formal instruction. When he was 16, he completed his training and moved on to the École Militaire in Paris, a place of greater prestige. Paris in the late 18th century was filled with activity. Carriages rattled along cobblestones, market stalls crowded the streets, and the Seine flowed quietly through the city. Napoleon walked through these streets as a young man, absorbing the atmosphere of a capital that would later come to symbolize both his rise and his fall. He studied artillery, a field that required careful mathematics, patience, and precision. These qualities matched his natural talents. Artillery would become the basis of many of his early successes, particularly during the Siege of Toulon and later during his Italian campaigns. By the time he completed his training, Napoleon was a young officer with a sharp mind and a deep reservoir of discipline. He was not yet the man who would lead armies across Europe, but the foundation had been laid. His early years in Corsica had given him a sense of identity and resilience. His education in France had sharpened his intellect and determination. Together, these experiences formed the quiet beginning of a path that would soon sweep him into the center of European history. In the next chapter, we will drift gently into the early stages of his military career, exploring how a young lieutenant began to rise within a world about to change. Part 3. The young officer, Napoleon's first steps into a changing world. As we drift deeper into the quiet unfolding of Napoleon's early life, we arrive at the threshold of his first years as a soldier. These were gentle yet formative times, moments when he began to understand not only the structure of the French military but also the wider tensions shaping Europe. Before he commanded armies or governed countries, he was simply a young artillery officer, thoughtful, intense, and quietly observant. His role was small, but his habits, his reflections, and his early responsibilities began to shape the disciplined mind that would one day carry immense weight. Imagine Napoleon in his late teens. He is thin, serious, and often lost in thought. His uniform is modest, not nearly as ornate as those worn by cavalry officers or members of prestigious regiments. His chosen field, artillery, is not glamorous, but it is deeply intellectual. It requires mathematics to calculate range and trajectory. It requires precision, patience, and the ability to see a battlefield not as chaos, but as a moving puzzle. This suited him well. He was not drawn to drama or unnecessary bravado. He preferred analysis, quiet study, and steady organization. At this stage in his life, France was uneasy. The revolution was still unfolding, and no one knew what the future would bring. Traditional hierarchies had begun to crumble. Kings and nobles had lost the unquestioned authority they once held. The military, too, was changing. Officers who had been appointed by birthright suddenly found themselves serving alongside talented young men who had risen through merit. Napoleon, coming from a minor noble family with few privileges, found that this shifting world offered him chances that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. He received his first commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery. His initial assignments took him to quiet garrisons and coastal towns, places where the air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the rhythm of daily life was slow. The soldiers under him were often young, sometimes restless, but generally respectful of an officer who spoke directly and worked harder than anyone around him. Napoleon did not command through charm or theatrics. Instead, he led by example. He organized supplies carefully, inspected equipment regularly, and kept firing drills precise and efficient. In these early years, he spent long evenings reading in his quarters. His room would be lit by a single candle, flickering gently against the stone walls. Stacks of books lay nearby, most of them about history, philosophy, or military science. He read Roman authors with great admiration. He studied the campaigns of ancient generals. He explored ideas about governance, law, and society. These readings were not idle hobbies. They were seeds quietly taking root in his mind, forming the foundation of future decisions. Yet outside his personal reflections, France itself was changing rapidly. The revolution had created uncertainty in every part of society. In cities like Paris and Lyon, crowds gathered in the streets to debate new political ideas. Newspaper headlines shifted daily. Rumors spread quickly. People felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. For soldiers like Napoleon, these shifts were especially intense. Officers loyal to the old monarchy were being removed or fleeing the country. Those who remained often felt unsure of how to navigate the new order. Napoleon watched these transformations carefully. He was not drawn to the most extreme factions, but he understood that France was entering a new age. This awareness shaped how he approached his military responsibilities. He kept himself disciplined. He avoided unnecessary conflict with superiors. And most importantly, he remained open to opportunities that might arise as the older structures continued to break apart. One of the most significant moments of these early years came during his time stationed in Valence, a charming town along the Rhone River. Here, he experienced both the serenity of provincial France and the intellectual curiosity of growing friendships. Some evenings, Napoleon would walk along the riverbanks, listening to the gentle flow of water as he pondered his ambitions. He wrote letters filled with reflections about life, history, and the uncertain path before him. He was not yet confident of greatness, but he felt a persistent sense that his future would be unusual. In Valence, he also interacted with civilians who were encouraged by the revolution's ideas but uncertain about how they would translate into everyday life. Napoleon listened quietly during conversations about liberty and equality. He was already forming opinions about governance. He believed in order and efficiency. He admired the idea of talent rising above birthright. Yet he also recognized that sudden political upheaval could create chaos that harmed ordinary people. These balanced thoughts would later influence how he governed, but in these early years, they were simply observations forming slowly in a young officer's mind. As he moved between garrisons, Napoleon continued refining his professional skills. He learned how to position artillery for maximum effect. He learned how to read terrain. He studied the behavior of soldiers during long marches, harsh winters, and unexpected challenges. He became known for precision. When his superiors inspected his equipment, they found everything in perfect order. When he submitted reports, they were complete and detailed. These habits set him apart. During one winter assignment in Auxonne, a town near the eastern border of France, Napoleon spent countless hours practicing artillery calculations. The cold wind swept across the parade grounds, carrying the crisp scent of snow. He and his fellow officers practiced with determination, maintaining their routines despite the weather. Napoleon would return to his room with chilled hands and continue studying late into the night. It was during this period that he deepened his professional understanding of artillery and logistics. Though still young, he had already begun to develop the skills that would make him a formidable commander. These early military years were also marked by introspection. Napoleon kept notebooks where he wrote about discipline, leadership, and personal growth. His writing style was direct and thoughtful. He often evaluated his own strengths and weaknesses, searching for ways to improve. This habit of self-study would stay with him throughout his life. It allowed him to learn quickly from mistakes and adapt to new circumstances with remarkable speed. Meanwhile, France moved steadily toward greater turmoil. Tensions with neighboring countries increased as European monarchies viewed the revolution with suspicion and fear. Some kings worried that revolutionary ideas might spread into their own lands. Others feared the unpredictability of France's new political leaders. Diplomats tried to negotiate, but mistrust grew. By the early 1790s, Europe began drifting toward conflict. Napoleon, stationed in modest posts, felt the distant pull of these events. Soldiers spoke quietly in barracks about war rumors. Newspapers circulated stories about rising tensions. Revolutionary leaders called for greater national defense. Young officers wondered how they might be called upon to serve. Napoleon sensed that the era of quiet garrison work was coming to an end. In 1793, an opportunity arrived that would change his future. France faced internal conflict and external threats. One strategic port city, Toulon, had been seized by forces opposed to the revolution and supported by foreign powers. The French government urgently needed skilled officers to help retake it. Napoleon, with his artillery expertise and reputation for precision, was assigned a role that would place him at the center of action for the first time. The young lieutenant who had wandered Corsican hillsides and studied by candlelight was now stepping into a position where his talents could shine. The quiet years of preparation were ending. A new phase was beginning. In Part 4, we will drift gently through the Siege of Toulon, a crucial moment when Napoleon first revealed his unique capabilities to the world. Part 4. The Siege of Toulon, a quiet turning point in a young officer's life. To understand how Napoleon's name first drifted into the wider awareness of France, we must travel softly to the southern coast, where the Mediterranean winds move gently across a harbor town shaped by both beauty and conflict. Toulon, with its calm blue waters and white stone buildings, does not seem like a place that would change the destiny of an ambitious young officer. Yet in the autumn of 1793, this quiet port became the setting for a moment that would quietly lift Napoleon Bonaparte from obscurity to national recognition. Let us begin by imagining Toulon as it was before the siege. The harbor is large and sheltered, filled with anchored ships that sway lightly in the afternoon breeze. The town streets wind between rows of houses with terracotta roofs. Children play in courtyards. Merchants display baskets of olives and figs. Fishermen mend nets along the shoreline. There is a gentle rhythm to daily life, shaped by the sound of waves against the docks. But in 1793, this calm setting became a symbol of uncertainty. France was in the midst of internal turmoil. The revolution, which had promised hope and change, had entered a fearful phase. Royalists and revolutionaries clashed in different regions. In Toulon, the tension reached a breaking point. The city's leaders, opposed to the revolutionary government, invited British and Spanish forces into the harbor, turning Toulon into a fortified stronghold against the French Republic. When word of this reached Paris, the government reacted with urgency. Toulon was not simply a rebellious city. It was home to a major naval base, one of the most important in France. Losing it threatened the country's security. Retaking it became an immediate priority, and the government sent an army south to reclaim the port. At this moment, Napoleon was still a relatively unknown young artillery officer. He had skill, ambition, and a deep understanding of artillery placement, but he had not yet been given an opportunity to prove himself on a significant scale. When he arrived in Toulon, he found a chaotic situation. Commanders argued about strategy. Supplies were short. Artillery placements were poorly organized. The soldiers were tired and discouraged, unsure of how to take a fortified city supported by powerful foreign fleets. Napoleon walked into this confusion with the same calm concentration he brought to everything. His uniform was plain. His rank modest. Few people paid attention to him at first. But he observed everything carefully, taking in the shape of the harbor, the placement of enemy forces, and the weaknesses in the French siege lines. He examined maps with quiet intensity, studying the terrain from every angle. His mind worked steadily, seeing patterns others had missed. What Napoleon realized was simple but decisive. The French could not retake Toulon simply by surrounding the city. The key lay across the water, on a pair of small but strategically crucial hills overlooking the harbor. These hills controlled the safest anchorage. If the French captured them, the British and Spanish fleets would be forced to withdraw, leaving Toulon vulnerable. Napoleon communicated this idea clearly, with diagrams and careful explanations. At first, his suggestions were dismissed. Senior commanders, surrounded by the stress of the siege, did not immediately trust the calculations of a young officer. Napoleon did not argue loudly or grow frustrated. He simply waited, continuing to refine his recommendations and quietly reorganizing the artillery units assigned to him. He inspected cannons personally, adjusting the alignment and ensuring the crews understood their responsibilities. He trained soldiers patiently, teaching them to load, aim, and fire with precision. He supervised fortifications, adding earthworks and reinforcing positions. Slowly, the artillery placements under his control became some of the most reliable in the entire siege. Eventually, the commanders came to see the wisdom of his plan. The French army prepared to attack the hills that guarded the harbor. The nights leading up to the assault were filled with the soft murmurs of soldiers praying, sharpening tools, and sharing quiet meals by lantern light. Napoleon walked among them, offering calm encouragement. He did not make grand speeches. He spoke simply, reminding the men of their purpose and explaining the plan with clarity. When the attack finally began, the air filled with the deep, rhythmic thunder of cannons. Smoke drifted across the hills in long grey veils. Yet even in the tension of battle, Napoleon's calm discipline guided his movements. He positioned artillery with expert precision, adjusting placements as the situation evolved. His decisions were made quickly but thoughtfully, each one carried out with the quiet assurance of a man who had spent years preparing for such a moment. The French succeeded. They captured the strategic heights, forcing the foreign fleets to withdraw. Without this naval support, the rebel leaders in Toulon could not maintain control. The city fell back into the hands of the French Republic. The siege had ended, and one young artillery captain had played a crucial role. In the days that followed, reports of Napoleon's actions reached Paris. His commanders spoke highly of him. Officials took notice. A quiet shift began. The young officer who had once felt overlooked suddenly found doors opening. He was promoted. His reputation began to grow. The government saw in him not only skill but potential. France was in need of talented leaders, and Napoleon had shown that he possessed something rare, something that combined discipline, clarity, and the ability to inspire others. For Napoleon himself, the victory at Toulon marked a turning point. It was not the triumph that defined his legacy, but it was the first clear moment when he stepped out of the shadows. He had taken a fractured situation and brought order. He had seen solutions where others saw confusion. Toulon did not elevate him to power immediately, but it marked the beginning of a path that would lead him into the heart of the political and military world. After the siege, Napoleon spent time reflecting. He wrote letters describing the experience, analyzing what had gone well and what could be improved. His mind remained steady, focused, and deeply aware that success was never permanent. He knew that challenges would continue. But he also knew something had shifted. Leaders now recognized him. Opportunities would come more quickly. As winter settled over France, Napoleon traveled to new assignments, carrying with him the knowledge that he had proven himself not only to others but to himself. He had discovered his capacity for leadership under pressure. He had seen how preparation, clarity, and calm determination could transform even the most difficult situation. In the next part, we will drift gently into the years that followed Toulon, exploring Napoleon's continued rise during a period of political uncertainty in France, when chaos and opportunity intertwined in subtle and unexpected ways. Part 5. A France in turmoil, opportunity in the unsteady years after Toulon. In the quiet period following the siege of Toulon, Napoleon Bonaparte stepped cautiously into a France that was uncertain of its future. The revolution had swept away the old order, but the new one had not yet found its balance. While the streets of many towns remained lively, and markets continued their familiar rhythms, there was a subtle nervousness in the air, like a faint tremor beneath the surface of daily life. It was within this atmosphere that Napoleon began to rise, not through sudden glory, but through steady, disciplined work during a time when France desperately needed structure. To picture France in these years, imagine traveling across the countryside during a soft autumn morning. The fields are quiet, dotted with haystacks left over from late harvests. Villagers tend to their animals, gather crops, and try to maintain the same traditions their parents and grandparents practiced. Yet even in these calm scenes, change is ever present. New officials appointed by the revolutionary government visit towns to enforce policies. Soldiers march along rural roads, carrying worn packs and muskets. Some are hopeful about the future. Others are weary from endless political shifts. In cities, the atmosphere is even more tense. Streets are filled with posters announcing new laws. Debates erupt in taverns and coffee houses. Newspapers publish conflicting stories, creating constant waves of uncertainty. The government, known as the National Convention and later the Directory, struggles to keep control. Rival political factions argue loudly. Some call for more radical measures. Others beg for moderation. Ordinary citizens feel caught in the middle, unsure which direction the country will take. It was during this fragile period that Napoleon's rise quietly accelerated. His success at Toulon caught the attention of influential leaders, earning him recognition he had never experienced before. He received a promotion and new responsibilities, yet he approached his duties with the same seriousness and precision that had defined his early years. One of his first assignments after Toulon took him to the French army of Italy. At this time, France was involved in conflicts on multiple fronts. The Italian campaign was particularly important because the territories along the border were crucial for maintaining influence and securing resources. The army there struggled with inadequate supplies and uncertain leadership. Napoleon, though still young, brought a clarity of thought that impressed both superiors and soldiers alike. During this period, Napoleon continued to refine his skills in artillery and strategy. He spent long evenings studying maps, analyzing routes, and considering how terrain could be used to an army's advantage. His nights often passed quietly, with a single candle illuminating his desk, the faint scent of ink mixing with the crisp mountain air drifting through open windows. He knew that France's fate depended on the strength of its armies and that every detail mattered. Yet while he gave much of his time to study and preparation, Napoleon also grew increasingly aware of the political landscape in Paris. Power shifted frequently, and any officer with ambition needed to understand how politics influenced military assignments. He wrote letters to leaders he hoped to impress, carefully choosing his words. These letters were not loud declarations of ambition. Instead, they were thoughtful reports, filled with practical ideas about improving the military and securing France's position. As Napoleon moved through various assignments, he encountered challenges that tested both his patience and his confidence. At times, he felt overlooked. At other moments, he found himself at odds with superiors who did not appreciate his ideas. The uncertainty weighed on him, yet he continued to work steadily, holding to the belief that his dedication would eventually reveal his worth. One of the most significant turning points during these years occurred in 1795, in the capital city of Paris. France was again facing internal conflict. A major revolt threatened the government, and tensions rose quickly. The streets, once lively with commerce, became crowded with armed mobs demanding political change. The government needed someone capable of restoring order quickly, and many officers hesitated, concerned about the consequences. Napoleon did not hesitate. Although he was still a relatively young general, his confidence in his strategic abilities led him to accept the responsibility placed before him. He coordinated the defense of key government buildings and prepared artillery placements with the same precision he had used at Toulon. When the uprising reached its peak, Napoleon's clear instructions and organized defenses allowed the government forces to remain steady. The revolt dissipated, and order returned to the city. This event, sometimes referred to simply as the whiff of grapeshot, was a quiet but defining moment. Napoleon had proven himself in the eyes of Paris's political leaders. His actions saved the government from collapse, and in doing so, he revealed his ability to take control in chaotic situations. He had shown clarity, discipline, and decisiveness when others faltered. Following this, Napoleon's reputation grew significantly. He received new responsibilities and greater trust from the Directory. People who had never heard his name just a year before now spoke of him as a rising star, a young general whose mind seemed to grasp the complexities of war and governance with effortless precision. Yet Napoleon himself remained thoughtful and cautious. He understood how quickly fortunes could change in revolutionary France. He knew that he had to continue proving himself through consistent work, not simply through one moment of success. Throughout this time, he continued to correspond with his family in Corsica. His letters reveal a young man who, despite growing responsibilities, remained connected to his homeland. He expressed concern for his relatives and reflected on the path his life had taken. These private writings remind us that Napoleon was not yet the imposing figure history often remembers. He was still forming his identity, still growing into the role that destiny seemed to be preparing for him. As he began to gain more influence, Napoleon also developed a deeper appreciation for the importance of discipline and organization within the French military. He saw the difficulty of training an army composed of men from different regions, with varying levels of experience. Many soldiers were patriotic and eager to defend France. Others joined the army simply for steady pay or because they had few other options. Napoleon approached these challenges with patience. He worked to instill confidence and structure, believing that a well-led army could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. The years between Toulon and the start of his major campaigns were filled with travel, letters, study, and quiet preparation. Napoleon often found himself in different towns each month, moving from one assignment to another. Yet in every place he visited, he left an impression of someone deeply focused and unshakable, someone who thought far beyond the present moment. As France struggled through political shifts, economic difficulties, and constant threats from abroad, Napoleon remained committed to the idea that a disciplined and strategic approach could guide the nation through uncertainty. He was still learning, still observing, still preparing. Soon, this preparation would lead him to a new command, one that would bring him into the heart of the Italian peninsula and ultimately reveal his extraordinary abilities on a grand scale. In Part 6, we will drift gently into the beginning of Napoleon's Italian campaign, exploring how a young general transformed a struggling army into a force that reshaped Europe. Part 6. The First Italian Campaign, a quiet transformation of an entire army. By the spring of 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself standing at the edge of a new chapter. France had called upon him once again, this time with a responsibility far greater than anything he had known before. At only 26 years old, he was appointed commander of the Army of Italy, a force that existed more in name than in strength. It was underfed, poorly supplied, and weary from years of hardship. Yet as we move quietly into this part of his story, the focus is not on dramatic victories or loud clashes, but on the slow, steady transformation of a struggling army under the guidance of a young general whose clarity and discipline reshaped everything he touched. To picture the French army of Italy at the moment Napoleon arrived, imagine soldiers resting in makeshift camps along rugged mountain pathways. Tents made from patched canvas flutter gently in the alpine wind. Boots are worn. Coats are thin. Supplies are scarce. Some soldiers sit quietly near small fires, trying to warm their hands. Others stand in line waiting for modest portions of bread. Many are discouraged. They have heard promises from commanders before and watched them fade into the same familiar pattern of hunger and exhaustion. Napoleon arrives without fanfare. He steps into camp with a light stride, carrying himself with a firmness that seems out of place for someone so young. His voice, though not loud, is clear and confident. He walks through the lines of soldiers, observing everything. The worn uniforms, the weak rations, the expressions of men who feel forgotten. Yet instead of reprimanding them or offering empty encouragement, he speaks plainly. France needs them. They will soon have food, weapons, and movement. They will no longer wait. Their efforts will matter. The soldiers listen. They are skeptical, yet his presence holds their attention. There is something different about him. He seems to see not what they are, but what they could become. Within days, Napoleon begins reorganizing the army with quiet efficiency. He does not make sweeping announcements or rely on dramatic gestures. Instead, he studies the terrain carefully, spreading maps across tables in dimly lit tents. Lanterns cast warm circles of light over the paper as he traces valleys, rivers, and roads with deliberate motions. He sees patterns that many others had overlooked. The Alps, which seemed like a barrier to others, appear to him as a series of pathways. The Italian plains, which seemed distant and unreachable, look like opportunities. He understands something crucial: movement will be the key. Speed, coordination, and precision will transform this worn army into a force capable of facing the Austrian and Piedmontese troops that stand against them. He prepares the soldiers not through long speeches, but through planning and action. Soon, he calls the officers together and speaks to them with calm firmness. He explains the strategy. He tells them that they will no longer retreat or wait for supplies that never arrive. They will advance, taking what they need by surprising the enemy, moving quickly, and using the terrain to their advantage. The officers, like the soldiers, feel a subtle shift. This new commander has vision. He sees the whole landscape at once. When the army begins to move, the transformation is gentle but steady. The first marches take the soldiers through narrow mountain passes where mist clings to the rocks and the air is cool. The sound of their footsteps blends with the distant calls of goats on the slopes. The terrain is harsh, but the morale is rising. For the first time in months, the soldiers feel purpose. They are no longer sitting idle, waiting for decisions from distant leaders. They are part of a plan. Napoleon rides ahead on horseback, scanning the distance with thoughtful eyes. He stops often to observe the layout of hills and valleys, making small adjustments to the plan. His officers follow closely, listening to his quiet but confident instructions. The soldiers watch him with growing admiration. They see a commander who is present, engaged, and tireless. The early engagements of the Italian campaign unfold with a combination of precision and fluidity. Napoleon uses the speed of his troops to outmaneuver larger forces. He has them strike where the enemy least expects it, turning weaknesses into opportunities. The soldiers begin to witness victories, small at first but deeply encouraging. They capture supplies, secure new positions, and gradually gain confidence. One can imagine a quiet evening after one of these early successes. The French soldiers sit around fires, eating better food than they have tasted in weeks. Their faces are still tired, but their voices carry a new energy. Some speak about the young general who leads them. They describe how he rides beside them during marches, how he studies the terrain with focus, how he gives orders that are both simple and effective. There is a sense of pride forming within the camp. Napoleon himself does not rest much. While the army sleeps, he continues reviewing maps, writing orders, and preparing for the days ahead. His mind seems constantly active, always considering possibilities. Yet there is calm within his routine. His movements are measured. His decisions are deliberate. He respects the weight of command, knowing that the lives of thousands depend on the clarity of his judgment. As the campaign deepens, the army pushes farther into northern Italy. Villages along the route watch the French troops pass quietly through cobblestone streets. Children peek from windows. Local elders gather at doorways, whispering about the young general who leads them. Some fear the presence of soldiers. Others sense that history is moving through their town, reshaping the world beyond their understanding. The battles of Montenotte, Millesimo, and Dego unfold in a pattern that begins to define Napoleon's approach. He divides his forces to confuse the enemy, then reunites them precisely at the right moment. He uses hills for cover and rivers for advantage. He makes decisions quickly, almost instinctively, yet grounded in careful reasoning. The soldiers follow him with increasing trust. They see how each victory brings more supplies. They feel their strength returning. They begin to understand that they are no longer simply a struggling army. They are becoming a unified force with purpose. Meanwhile, news of Napoleon's successes travels slowly to Paris. Government officials, initially unsure of the young general, begin to sense that something significant is happening in Italy. Reports describe astonishing speed, clever maneuvers, and unexpected victories. Letters from officers praise Napoleon's calm leadership and his ability to bring out the best in the troops. Yet in northern Italy, the atmosphere within the army remains grounded. Even as victories accumulate, Napoleon maintains the same quiet discipline. He continues walking among the soldiers, speaking to them directly. He listens to their concerns. He rewards their achievements. His presence does not grow distant or ceremonial. It remains immediate and human. By late spring, the campaign has shifted from initial survival to growing momentum. Napoleon's army has driven one enemy to negotiate and continues pushing against another. Each step forward begins to shape not only the military landscape, but also the political future of Europe. What makes this period so gentle within a sleep-friendly retelling is not the battles themselves, but the transformation occurring within thousands of people. Men who once felt forgotten and weary now feel capable and purposeful. Officers who once doubted the future now see clarity in their commanders' plans. And Napoleon, still young, begins to understand that leadership is as much about trust and vision as it is about tactics. In the next part, we will drift softly into the height of the Italian campaign, exploring how Napoleon used innovation and intuition to reshape not only the battlefield, but the morale and identity of his entire army. Part 7. Crossing the plains, the Italian campaign reaches its quiet height. By the time spring gave way to summer in 1796, Napoleon Bonaparte's army of Italy had transformed from a weary, uncertain collection of regiments into a unified force with rising confidence. The early victories had not been loud or theatrical, but they had been meaningful. Each success, no matter how small, strengthened the sense of purpose that moved quietly through the ranks. What had begun as an army struggling for supplies was now advancing steadily across the northern Italian plains, guided by a young general whose clarity of vision seemed to cut through uncertainty like sunlight through morning mist. To understand this turning point in a sleep-friendly way, imagine the gentle landscape of northern Italy. The foothills of the Alps recede into rolling fields dotted with vineyards and small villages. Olive trees sway in warm breezes. Rivers wind across the plains, reflecting the soft glow of the sky. Early in the mornings, mist rises from the ground, creating a veil of silver light through which soldiers march in quiet lines. This region, naturally beautiful, held enormous strategic value. Armies moved through it seeking control of key river crossings and roads that connected important cities. Napoleon understood this deeply. His maps, spread out on tables inside modest field tents, showed not only the terrain but the patterns of movement and opportunity that the land provided. He spent hours tracing routes with his finger, visualizing how his army could use speed to strike before the enemy had time to reorganize. The soldiers who marched beside him noticed these small details. They watched him pause at hillsides to study the ground. They saw him ride ahead to scout riverbanks. His planning did not feel distant or abstract. It felt practical, steady, and rooted in an understanding of how ordinary men moved through difficult conditions. As the army advanced, Napoleon continued to engage with his soldiers in a quiet, human way. In the evenings, when fires glowed across the camp, he walked among groups of men sharing bread and wine. He listened to their stories. He explained the goals of the next day. His presence made the long marches feel purposeful rather than burdensome. Many soldiers later recalled that they felt protected by his awareness, as if he could see dangers and opportunities long before they appeared. The Austrian forces opposing him were larger and traditionally well organized, but they struggled to understand the shifting tactics of this young general. Napoleon refused to fight according to old patterns. He preferred to move quickly, spreading his divisions across wide areas, then concentrating them at precisely the right moment. It was as if he could sense the flow of a battle long before it happened, adjusting his approach with calm flexibility. Throughout the summer, a series of engagements unfolded across the plains. At Lodi, the French army encountered a strong Austrian position across a river. The bridge was long and exposed, guarded by heavy fire. For any other general, this might have caused hesitation. For Napoleon, it was another puzzle. He studied the enemy lines, observed the patterns of fire, and saw the possibility of a breakthrough. What followed became one of the campaign's most memorable moments, not because it was dramatic, but because it symbolized Napoleon's ability to inspire bravery through quiet certainty. The French soldiers advanced over the bridge while artillery provided covering fire. Napoleon stood close behind the advancing columns, directing movements and encouraging his men. The crossing succeeded, and the Austrians retreated. Many soldiers later described how Napoleon's presence on the field had erased their fears, replacing them with calm determination. After Lodi, the army continued its advance through Lombardy. Cities that had once viewed the French with suspicion began to observe something different. They saw discipline rather than chaos. They saw leadership that balanced firmness with reason. Local people watched from doorways as Napoleon rode through quiet streets, and many sensed that this was a leader unlike those they had known before. His youth made him seem fresh, unburdened by the old political rivalries of Europe. During this period, Napoleon also revealed his skill as an administrator. He negotiated agreements with city leaders, reorganized local governments, and sought supplies for his army without unnecessary cruelty. He understood that the support or cooperation of local populations could influence the outcome of a campaign just as much as battlefield movements. His approach was strategic, but also measured, aware that long-term success required more than force. The summer evenings during the Italian campaign were often calm. After days of marching or skirmishes, the army made camp near rivers or in open fields. Soldiers washed their clothes in shallow streams. Officers discussed upcoming routes under the shade of trees. The air carried the scent of wild herbs and distant fireplaces. Napoleon often remained awake long after others slept, writing letters by candlelight. These letters were filled not with boastfulness, but with reflections on geography, morale, and the shifting balance of power. One could imagine him sitting alone in his tent, the soft glow of the candle illuminating maps and pages. Outside, the steady sounds of the camp settling for the night shaped a gentle rhythm. The rustle of fabric, the quiet conversations of soldiers, the occasional snort of weary horses. It was within this calm environment that Napoleon planned movements that would reshape the face of Europe. The deeper the army moved into the plains, the more Napoleon recognized the importance of unity among his soldiers. He rewarded bravery. He promoted officers based on talent rather than social origin. He ensured that supplies reached those who needed them most. This approach strengthened loyalty. Soldiers felt seen and valued. They carried themselves with new confidence, aware that their efforts contributed to something important. Meanwhile, the Austrian commanders struggled to adapt. Their traditional methods, based on predictable formations and steady advances, did not match Napoleon's fluid strategy. His army moved too quickly. His decisions came too unexpectedly. What had once been a slow, grinding war in the Italian theater was becoming something different, shaped by momentum rather than stagnation. As the campaign progressed, more Italian cities and regions found themselves negotiating with the French. Some welcomed the changes brought by Napoleon's presence. Others resisted. Yet even those who opposed him could not deny the remarkable discipline and organization of his forces. They had expected chaos from a revolutionary army. Instead, they observed structure and careful planning. By late summer, the army of Italy had achieved several major victories, and Napoleon's name began to circulate widely in France and beyond. Newspapers published stories about him. Letters from soldiers described a commander who seemed to understand the land, the weather, and the people with unusual clarity. Politicians in Paris took increased interest in his actions, realizing that he possessed both military talent and the potential for influence. Still, within the gentle rhythm of this retelling, it is important to remember that Napoleon remained focused on the next step rather than distant ambitions. His mind stayed rooted in details. He thought about river crossings, supply routes, and the health of his men. His horizon was filled not with dreams of empire, but with maps of valleys and vineyards. Late in the campaign, after several significant Austrian retreats, Napoleon wrote that the army was no longer the same one he had inherited. It was now confident, cohesive, and prepared for whatever came next. He credited the soldiers, describing their endurance and bravery with admiration. The Italian campaign had not yet concluded. More challenges awaited. Yet something had changed permanently. Napoleon had shown that he could guide not only movements on a battlefield but the spirit of an entire army. He had revealed an ability to transform exhaustion into confidence, uncertainty into momentum. In Part 8, we will drift softly into the final phase of the Italian campaign, exploring how Napoleon's continued success reshaped European diplomacy and positioned him at the center of France's future. Part 8. The final steps through Italy, diplomacy, resolve, and the quiet rewriting of Europe. As the Italian campaign moved toward its final stages in late 1796 and early 1797, a sense of transformation settled over the northern Italian landscape. What had begun as a desperate effort to revive a neglected army had become a sweeping journey across plains, rivers, and mountain valleys. Now, as autumn leaves drifted across quiet roads and frost collected on olive branches, the French army of Italy found itself not simply fighting battles, but shaping the future of a continent. And at the center of this slow, reflective turning of history stood Napoleon Bonaparte, still young, still tireless, guiding events with a steadiness that surprised even those closest to him. To settle into this part of the story, imagine the Italian countryside in the gentle months between late summer and early winter. The heat of summer has softened. Mornings carry a cool mist that rises from the fields. The vineyards glow with fading gold. Farmers begin preparing for colder days, gathering remaining grapes, storing grain, and patching stone walls before winter sets in. Life continues at a natural rhythm, even as armies move quietly along nearby roads. During these months, Napoleon's army continued pressing the Austrians northward. Yet the nature of the campaign was changing. The soldiers were more confident. The officers more synchronized. Supply lines now flowed more reliably, supported by captured resources and negotiated agreements with local regions. The soldiers marched with steady purpose through small villages, sometimes greeted with curiosity, sometimes with caution. Local children watched them pass, unaware that the events unfolding around them would be remembered for generations. Napoleon himself had grown more assured, though not yet grand. He still wore simple uniforms. He still preferred quiet analysis to ceremony. Each day began early, often before sunrise, with a modest breakfast followed by hours of studying maps. He considered not only troop movements, but weather patterns, road conditions, and the varied loyalties of Italian states. His ability to grasp a wide picture while remaining attentive to small details continued to guide him. The final months of the Italian campaign were marked by a deepening interplay between warfare and diplomacy. The Austrian Empire, still powerful, struggled to maintain control over its Italian territories. Napoleon's rapid advances had surprised them, but now he moved not simply as a military commander, but as a negotiator. He sent envoys to local rulers, explaining terms with calm clarity. He reassured some, pressured others, encouraged a few to rethink their alliances. His letters from this period reveal a mind increasingly comfortable navigating both battlefield strategies and political agreements. In cities like Milan, Verona, and Venice, the presence of the French army created a quiet but unmistakable shift in atmosphere. Markets carried new goods. Local officials spoke of reforms, taxes, and the possibility of new governance structures. Some embraced the changes with hope. Others felt uneasy about the future. Yet even those who resisted recognized that the young general leading the French forces carried himself with unusual authority. Meanwhile, the soldiers maintained their routines. They marched across river crossings in orderly lines. They rested in fields at dusk, their fires glowing softly beneath the twilight sky. They followed Napoleon not with blind devotion, but with a sense of shared purpose that had grown throughout the campaign. They had watched him ride beside them in storms and under harsh summer sun. They had seen him examine terrain with care, choosing positions that kept them safe. They trusted him because he worked as tirelessly as they did. One of the final major battles of the campaign occurred near Arcalay, a village situated among marshlands and narrow bridges. The terrain was challenging, filled with reeds, mud, and winding water channels. The Austrians believed this difficult ground would give them an advantage. But Napoleon observed the marshes with the same calm precision he brought to every situation. He saw opportunities in the narrow crossings, recognizing that the enemy's strong defenses could be disrupted through swift, coordinated movements. The French advance at Arcalay was slow, steady, and filled with quiet determination. Soldiers moved through marshland as thick fog rolled across the water. The sound of splashing boots and muffled instructions blended with the distant calls of marsh birds. The fighting that occurred here was difficult, but in this soft retelling, the focus remains not on the clash, but on the unwavering spirit of the individuals who pressed forward under Napoleon's guidance. After days of persistence, the French forced the Austrians to retreat. It was not a moment of loud celebration. Instead, relief spread gently across the ranks. Soldiers rested on the dry banks, wiping mud from their uniforms and sharing quiet smiles. Napoleon moved among them, offering a few words of praise, reminding them of their unity and endurance. The success at Arcole led to further Austrian withdrawals. The momentum was returning entirely to the French. Slowly, the map of northern Italy shifted, city by city, valley by valley. Like a soft tide moving across the shore, Napoleon's influence expanded through measured steps, each one adding to the larger transformation. By the beginning of 1797, the Austrians could see that the campaign would not turn back in their favor. Their armies had been pushed back repeatedly. Their supply lines were stretched. Their commanders grew increasingly anxious. Diplomats sent tentative messages suggesting discussions. The French government, recognizing Napoleon's success, encouraged negotiations but relied heavily on his judgment. Napoleon approached diplomacy with the same calm precision that had defined his military decisions. He understood that Austria was still powerful, and that France needed a favorable settlement. He also recognized that showing respect in negotiations could achieve more lasting outcomes than seeking humiliation of the enemy. His letters from this time reveal a thoughtful tone, measured and focused on stability. The negotiations led to the Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in the autumn of 1797. While this is a historical milestone, in a gentle, sleep-focused retelling, what matters most is the atmosphere around it. Picture a quiet villa in northern Italy, surrounded by tall cypress trees and soft autumn light. Inside, diplomats sit around a long wooden table. Quills scratch softly across parchment. Voices remain calm, steady, and deliberate. Outside, the wind moves through the garden, carrying the scent of fading leaves. The treaty brought a formal end to the Italian campaign. It reshaped borders across Europe. It granted France influence over much of northern Italy. But perhaps most significantly, it established Napoleon not merely as a successful commander, but as a figure capable of navigating the delicate balance between military action and political negotiation. When he returned to his headquarters after the treaty was signed, soldiers greeted him with quiet admiration. He had led them through mountains, across rivers, and into the heart of Italy. He had given them purpose and stability. They saw in him not only a general, but a leader who understood the challenges of war and the importance of peace. For Napoleon himself, the end of the Italian campaign marked the close of an extraordinary year. He had risen from relative obscurity to international recognition. Yet he did not rush into celebration. Instead, he spent time reviewing reports, analyzing lessons learned, and preparing for whatever France would ask of him next. His mind, always active, continued to seek clarity and order, even in victory. In Part 9, we will drift gently into the period following the Italian campaign, when Napoleon returned to Paris and found himself stepping into a new world of politics, expectations, and possibilities. Part 9. A quiet return to Paris, fame, expectation, and the soft glow of a changing future. When Napoleon Bonaparte returned to Paris after the conclusion of the Italian campaign, the city received him not with loud celebration, but with a quiet sense of curiosity, admiration, and restrained wonder. He had left as a young general known only to a handful of officials, but now he arrived as a figure whispered about in salons, discussed in newspapers, and observed with careful attention by those who shaped France's uncertain political future. And yet, within this retelling, we focus not on noise or spectacle, but on the gentle unfolding of a new chapter in Napoleon's life, one marked by reflection, transition, and the soft weight of expectation. Imagine Paris in the late months of 1797. The revolution has reshaped the city, but its rhythms persist. The Seine flows peacefully beneath its bridges. Market stalls line the narrow streets, filled with the scent of fresh bread, herbs, and roasted chestnuts. Lanterns flicker in the evening breeze. Carriages roll slowly across cobblestones. At night, the glow from windows reflects on wet pavement after a light rain. Beneath all this calm activity lies a subtle awareness that France stands at the threshold of change, waiting for a new direction. Into this environment, Napoleon returns quietly. He is still young, his uniform simple, his steps purposeful. The victories in Italy have given him fame, but he carries himself with restraint. He spends his first days visiting officials, military depots, and modest offices where reports are reviewed. He speaks softly, offering clear and precise descriptions of the campaign. Those who meet him notice that he does not exaggerate his achievements. Instead, he focuses on the soldiers, the terrain, and the lessons learned. The Directory, the governing body of France at this time, observes Napoleon with both admiration and caution. They recognize his brilliance, yet they also sense his growing influence. In the soft political climate of Paris, where conversations in salons shape alliances and quiet rumors travel faster than letters, they understand that a successful general can inspire powerful loyalties. Still, they treat him warmly. They host gatherings in his honor. They request his input on military matters. And they watch him closely. Napoleon, for his part, enters these political spaces with the same quiet discipline he brings to every endeavor. He listens more than he speaks. He studies the expressions and tones of those around him, learning quickly which officials value stability, which seek ambition, and which hold their positions out of convenience rather than conviction. He is not yet interested in political power for its own sake, but he recognizes that understanding the government is essential if he is to serve France effectively. During these early weeks in Paris, Napoleon also spends time reuniting with friends and acquaintances. Some had followed his career from a distance, reading reports of battles in Italy. They greet him warmly, offering congratulations and speaking with excitement about the future. Napoleon accepts their praise politely, but his mind remains focused. He is not swept away by the attention. He moves through the city with calm purpose, aware that success is temporary and that the next chapter remains uncertain. One of the most meaningful aspects of this period is Napoleon's increasing awareness of his role not just as a commander, but as a public figure. He reads newspapers that describe him as a hero. He sees his name printed in pamphlets and reports. In cafes and salons, people discuss his strategies with admiration. Some view him as a symbol of renewed French strength. Others see him as a young man capable of guiding the nation toward stability. Napoleon takes note of all this quietly, neither encouraging nor rejecting the praise. Yet even amid this growing attention, he remains deeply reflective. He walks along the riverbanks at dusk, observing the gentle movement of the Seine. He visits libraries and studies historical accounts of leaders who guided their countries through difficult periods. He writes letters to close associates, sharing his thoughts about France's political uncertainty. These letters reveal a mind both ambitious and cautious, aware that fame can shift quickly and that true leadership requires patience. Napoleon also spends time reflecting on the soldiers he commanded in Italy. He remembers their endurance during long marches, their bravery in difficult battles, and their loyalty during moments of uncertainty. He feels a deep responsibility toward them, aware that their trust contributed to the successes that now bring him recognition. When he writes to military officials in Paris, he frequently requests support for veterans, supplies for ongoing regiments, and reforms that would strengthen the army as a whole. This period in Paris is not marked by dramatic events. Instead, it unfolds gently, like a series of soft steps leading Napoleon toward something larger. He meets with government ministers. He advises on military strategy. He attends formal gatherings where diplomats, generals, and politicians discuss the future of Europe. These gatherings are lit by chandeliers, filled with quiet murmurs, and fragrant with wax candles and winter spices. Napoleon moves through them with composure, observing, listening, learning. One of the most significant developments during this time is the growing realization among French leaders that Napoleon's talents could extend beyond the battlefield. His clarity of thought, his ability to understand complex problems, and his calm manner when facing pressure demonstrate qualities that could benefit France in a broader capacity. Still, no one knows exactly where these qualities will lead. Napoleon himself remains uncertain. He has achieved remarkable success, but he senses that his path is only beginning. As the months pass, Napoleon becomes increasingly aware of the political instability of the Directory. Its members disagree frequently. Policies shift unpredictably. Public confidence wavers. Food prices rise and fall. Letters arrive daily describing unrest in different regions. France has won victories abroad, but uncertainty at home continues to grow. Napoleon observes these patterns with concern. He understands that without stability, the country cannot fully benefit from its military successes. During this time, another idea begins to form within him, though still quietly and without fixed shape. He realizes that France will soon need direction, either through stronger governance or through a new structure entirely. He does not yet imagine himself at the center of such a transformation. He only recognizes the need for clarity, discipline, and renewed confidence in the government. These months in Paris, gentle yet significant, allow Napoleon to gather his thoughts, assess the political environment, and prepare for the next steps that France may require from him. He is not in a hurry. He moves at a measured pace, balancing reflection with responsibility, ambition with restraint. Eventually, an opportunity arises that will take him away from Paris once more. The Directory, seeking to strengthen France's position, plans an expedition to the east, toward Egypt. They see this as a chance to expand influence, challenge rival powers, and divert Napoleon away from domestic politics. They offer him command of the mission, presenting it as an honorable assignment of great importance. Napoleon accepts calmly. He understands the significance of such an expedition and sees in it a new challenge, one that will allow him to test his abilities in a vast and unfamiliar landscape. He prepares quietly, studying geography, history, and logistics, just as he did before the Italian campaign. Thus, his time in Paris becomes a gentle pause between two major currents of history. A moment of reflection before another journey. A period of quiet light before the vast deserts, ancient monuments, and cultural wonders that await him in Egypt. In Part 10, we will drift softly into the beginning of the Egyptian expedition, exploring how Napoleon approached this new chapter with curiosity, discipline, and a profound sense of possibility. Part 10. Toward the land of ancient light, Napoleon prepares for the Egyptian expedition. As Napoleon Bonaparte prepared to leave France once more, he stepped quietly into a chapter unlike any he had ever experienced before. The Italian plains had offered him movement and possibility. Paris had offered reflection and rising expectation. But the journey ahead would carry him far beyond familiar borders, across seas touched by warm winds, into a land whose history stretched back thousands of years. It would be a journey not only of military ambition, but of curiosity, scholarship, and deep cultural wonder. And in the soft retelling of this story, the focus rests on the calm preparations, the gentle rhythms of thought, and the quiet sense of destiny that flowed through Napoleon's mind as he prepared for the Egyptian expedition. To imagine this moment, picture Napoleon moving through Paris in the spring of 1798. The city is alive with the sounds of daily life. Horses pull carriages along narrow streets. Bakers prepare bread in early dawn hours. Merchants call softly from their stalls, offering fruit, fabrics, and spices. But beneath this ordinary rhythm, gentle whispers follow Napoleon wherever he goes. People speak of him with admiration, curiosity, and a touch of awe. His victories in Italy have made him a figure of immense interest. Some see him as France's future hope. Others see him as unpredictable. But all of them sense something unusual in the calm, decisive way he carries himself. When France's governing body, the Directory, approached him with the idea of leading an expedition to Egypt, Napoleon listened carefully. They described the mission as an opportunity to expand French influence, to challenge British power, and to explore a land rich with ancient wisdom. They hoped the journey would strengthen France's global presence. Some also hoped it would send Napoleon far away from Parisian politics. Napoleon understood their motives, yet he felt drawn to the idea with a quiet sense of purpose. Egypt, in his imagination, was not simply a land to conquer. It was a world filled with mystery. Vast deserts, green banks along the Nile, temples carved with symbols older than memory. For a man who spent his nights reading history and philosophy, the chance to stand where ancient civilizations had risen was profoundly meaningful. He approached the assignment not as a routine military venture, but as a journey into the heart of human history. The preparations for the expedition unfolded with gentle thoroughness. Napoleon worked tirelessly, studying maps of the Mediterranean, reading accounts of travelers, and gathering information from scholars who knew of Egypt's geography and culture. He met with sailors, engineers, architects, and astronomers. He asked careful questions about tides, star navigation, desert climate, and river currents. His approach was not hurried. It was methodical, precise, and thoughtful. One of the most remarkable decisions he made during this stage was to assemble a group of scholars, scientists, and artists to accompany the expedition. These men were experts in mathematics, engineering, botany, astronomy, archaeology, and linguistics. Napoleon envisioned not just a military force crossing the sea, but an intellectual mission that would study, document, and learn from everything encountered along the way. It was an unusual choice for a general, but one that revealed his deep curiosity and his belief that knowledge could shape nations as powerfully as armies. Imagine these scholars arriving at the ports of Toulon and Marseille, carrying books, instruments, and careful notes. Their clothing rustles in the warm Mediterranean breeze as they prepare to board the ships. They speak softly among themselves about pyramids, ancient architecture, new plants that might grow along the Nile, and languages they hope to decipher. Their enthusiasm adds a gentle brightness to the atmosphere. Meanwhile, thousands of soldiers assemble for departure. They march into port cities with steady steps, filling the narrow streets with quiet anticipation. Some have fought alongside Napoleon in Italy. Others are new recruits. All are aware that the journey will carry them far from home, across waters they have never sailed, into landscapes they cannot yet imagine. Yet as Napoleon rides among them during inspections, offering calm instructions and subtle encouragement, they feel reassured. His presence, as always, provides a sense of direction. The ships themselves are prepared with great care. Supplies are loaded onto wooden decks. Barrels of water. Crates of dried food. Weapons. Tools. Books. Scientific instruments protected in layers of canvas. The air is filled with the scent of tar, sea salt, and hemp rope. Sailors move with practiced rhythm, adjusting sails, tightening ropes, and securing cargo. At dusk, lanterns glow along the docks, casting warm light onto the water where reflections ripple gently. Napoleon spends these final days in France reviewing plans, checking manifests, and meeting with officers. His mind remains steady. He speaks with clarity, offering simple, thoughtful instructions. Unlike moments of battlefield tension, this phase of preparation feels almost meditative. His focus is deep and calm. He walks slowly along the shoreline during quiet evenings, gazing out at the horizon. Perhaps he reflects on the vastness of the world he will soon cross. Perhaps he thinks of Egypt's ancient rulers, whose monuments have endured for millennia. Perhaps he imagines how France might grow through knowledge gained from foreign lands. During one such evening, one can imagine Napoleon stopping to watch the sun set over the sea. The light stretches across the water in long golden bands. The breeze carries the sound of sailors working on distant ships. In this moment of silence, he stands alone, a young general on the edge of history. The world around him softens. The sky darkens with gentle colors. He breathes deeply, aware that everything familiar will soon give way to something unknown. As departure day arrives, the expedition gathers on the docks. The scholars stand among crates of equipment. The soldiers line up in long columns. Officers receive final orders. Napoleon moves among them with quiet confidence, offering a few last instructions. There is little ceremony. The departure feels calm, purposeful, and focused. When the ships finally leave the harbor, the sound of creaking wood and snapping sails fills the air. The wind pushes gently against the canvas. The French coastline fades slowly into the distance. Soldiers lean against railings, watching their homeland shrink into a thin line. Scholars gather near the central deck, discussing what they hope to discover. Sailors move along the ropes, adjusting sails to catch warm Mediterranean winds. Napoleon stands near the ship's bow, gazing outward. The sea stretches endlessly ahead, smooth and reflective. Above, the sky opens wide, filled with soft clouds. For him, this is not simply a voyage across water. It is a passage into an ancient world he has long wished to see. Days at sea pass with a peaceful rhythm. The ships travel as a convoy, their triangular sails rising like quiet white wings above the turquoise water. At dawn, the horizon glows with gentle pastel colors. During nights, stars glitter, reflected in the sea like scattered lamps. Scholars measure celestial patterns with instruments. Soldiers clean equipment. Napoleon spends hours reading, writing, and contemplating the future. The sound of waves against the hull provides a constant, soothing backdrop. As the fleet moves southward, the air grows warmer. The scent of salt intensifies. Gulls follow the ships. The Mediterranean, with its long history of travelers, traders, and explorers, guides the expedition deeper into its blue expanse. Napoleon studies the sky, the winds, and the shifting currents, deepening his understanding of navigation. Throughout the voyage, he rarely raises his voice. He speaks thoughtfully to officers, reviews plans with scholars, and walks the decks in quiet reflection. His leadership remains steady and calm, shaping the mood of the entire expedition. When the ships begin nearing the shores of Egypt, the sunlight changes. It becomes brighter, softer, with a golden hue. The coastline appears slowly, like a distant dream. Sand dunes rise near the water. Palm trees stand in small clusters. Ancient land meets modern travelers. This, however, is where Part 10 draws to a gentle close. Not with arrival, not with conflict, but with anticipation. Napoleon and his men are poised at the edge of a land older than memory, carrying with them curiosity, purpose, and the quiet belief that their journey will shape the world in ways they cannot yet imagine. In Part 11, we will drift slowly into Egypt itself, exploring the first days on land, the heat of the desert, the quiet astonishment of the scholars, and Napoleon's early impressions of a world filled with ancient wonders. Part 11. First steps on ancient sand, and Napoleon enters Egypt and meets a world of light and silence. When the French fleet finally approached the shores of Egypt in the summer of 1798, the air carried a different kind of warmth, softer yet more profound than anything the soldiers had known before. For days they had watched the coastline rise slowly out of the haze, first as a faint golden ribbon on the horizon, then as a landscape of gentle dunes and distant palms shimmering beneath the sun. The sea around them grew calmer, as if the Mediterranean itself understood that this journey was reaching one of its most meaningful moments. And as Napoleon Bonaparte looked toward the silent stretch of desert ahead, he felt the quiet pull of history unfolding in a place that had shaped civilizations long before the world he knew even existed. The landing at Alexandria was not dramatic in this retelling. Instead, it felt like a slow, contemplative crossing from one world into another. Soldiers disembarked onto the warm sand as the wind carried the scent of salt and distant garden herbs. The hulls of the ships creaked behind them. Waves brushed the shore in steady rhythms. Napoleon stepped onto the beach with calm purpose, his boots sinking slightly into the fine grains. Around him, the scholars, officers, and soldiers who had traveled for weeks across the sea paused for a moment to take in the vastness of the land before them. Egypt greeted them with quiet dignity. The sky was a deep, clear blue. The desert stretched outward like an endless golden sea. The sunlight cast long shadows behind the newcomers, emphasizing how small they were in comparison to this ancient landscape. Napoleon observed everything with thoughtful eyes. He had studied maps, read histories, and examined drawings, but none of that fully prepared him for the reality of standing on Egyptian soil. The land seemed to hold its own kind of silence, a silence that was not empty but filled with stories waiting to be remembered. The city of Alexandria, once home to the legendary library that had nurtured centuries of knowledge, rose gently ahead. Its stone walls, weathered by time and wind, stood firm against the shifting sands. As Napoleon and his men approached, they passed through narrow streets filled with soft echoes of daily life. Merchants called quietly from shaded doorways. The smell of spices drifted through the air. Children observed the newcomers from behind latticed windows. The atmosphere felt ancient yet alive, carrying the weight of history in every corner. Napoleon moved through the city with measured steps. He did not rush, nor did he appear overwhelmed. Instead, he took in the details with an almost meditative focus. The patterns on the walls, the curves of the domes, the warm light reflecting off polished brass. He understood that Egypt was not simply a land to be entered, but a place to be respected. Its history stretched back thousands of years, shaped by pharaohs, scholars, and traders. Napoleon felt humbled by this depth. He had led armies across Europe, but here he walked among monuments that had witnessed centuries of civilizations rising and fading. The soldiers, too, felt the strangeness and beauty of their surroundings. They had grown accustomed to European landscapes filled with forests, rivers, and stone villages. Now they found themselves in a world where the horizon stretched endlessly, where the air shimmered with heat, and where ancient structures stood in silent endurance. At night, the desert sky opened into a vast tapestry of stars, brighter than anything they had seen before. Many soldiers lay on their backs outside their tents, looking upward in awe. The constellations felt close enough to touch. The scholars who accompanied the expedition were perhaps the most enchanted of all. They carried notebooks, brushes, and delicate instruments. From the moment they arrived, they began sketching, measuring, and recording every detail of the architecture, plants, insects, and cultural practices they encountered. They spoke softly among themselves about hieroglyphs, astronomy, and the scientific opportunities that Egypt presented. In their presence, Napoleon felt a sense of pride. He had brought knowledge into this journey, not just weaponry. In the first days after landing, Napoleon addressed the local population with calm respect. He acknowledged their traditions. He emphasized that the French came not as conquerors but as travelers seeking understanding. His words, delivered thoughtfully, reflected his awareness that a lasting presence in Egypt required cooperation and cultural sensitivity. Many listeners were cautious, yet they observed the French leader's manner with interest. He carried himself differently from other foreign officers they had encountered. He seemed attentive, disciplined, and curious. As the expedition moved inland, marching toward the Nile, the landscape shifted gently around them. The sand gave way to fertile soil near the riverbanks. Date palms rustled in warm breezes. Water birds glided across the surface of the Nile, their reflections shimmering in the soft morning light. Villages nestled along the river, each one shaped by centuries of agricultural rhythms. Farmers tended to crops using techniques as old as the land itself. Oxen pulled wooden plows. Children carried baskets of figs and melons. The soldiers watched these scenes with quiet fascination. Napoleon rode along the front of the marching column, observing the land carefully. The Nile's presence impressed him deeply. Its waters allowed life to flourish in a landscape that might otherwise seem barren. He began to understand how a civilization as magnificent as ancient Egypt could rise from this desert. The river was a source of sustenance, trade, and spiritual meaning. It flowed with a calm that seemed eternal. Along the river, the scholars gathered samples of plants and soil. They measured the angle of the sun. They documented construction methods used in village architecture. Napoleon visited them often, asking thoughtful questions. He encouraged their studies. In their efforts, he saw a reflection of his belief that knowledge was a powerful way of elevating a nation. These quiet exchanges between general and scholars brought a gentle warmth to the expedition. During evenings, when the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the heat softened into cool night air, Napoleon spent time writing at a small table near his tent. The sounds of the desert at night were soft and rhythmic. Crickets chirped in steady patterns. The Nile carried faint ripples against its banks. Occasionally a distant song or prayer drifted across the sands. Napoleon wrote observations about the land, reflections on its history, and ideas for new administrative structures. His writing from this period reveals a sense of wonder and a quiet humility before the vastness of Egyptian culture. He also walked alone at times, exploring the edges of the camp in silent contemplation. The desert at night offered a peace unlike anything he had known in Europe. The stars glimmered with remarkable clarity. The horizon faded softly into darkness. In these quiet moments, Napoleon reflected on the meaning of leadership, the fragility of human ambition, and the beauty of ancient civilizations that had stood long before France existed. As the expedition continued moving through Egypt, Napoleon found that the greatest challenges were not always military. They included understanding unfamiliar customs, navigating linguistic distances, and maintaining morale in a climate that challenged both body and mind. He addressed these obstacles with patience and adaptability. He introduced new routines to help the soldiers adjust to the heat. He encouraged respect toward local communities. He ensured that supplies were managed carefully to avoid hardship. The days passed gently, marked by slow adaptation to the environment. The soldiers grew accustomed to the desert winds. The scholars grew increasingly fascinated by the discoveries they made. Napoleon's leadership remained steady, thoughtful, and calm. This chapter of the expedition did not end with triumph or conflict, but with the quiet settling of the French presence into the Egyptian landscape. The early days had been a mixture of awe, curiosity, and adjustment. Napoleon felt the weight of history beneath his feet, aware that every step into this ancient land carried both opportunities and responsibilities. In Part 12, we will drift softly into the deeper heart of the Egyptian campaign, exploring the desert marches, the early administrative reforms Napoleon introduced, and the gentle, contemplative moments he experienced as he immersed himself further into one of the world's oldest civilizations. Part 12. Marching through sun and silence, Napoleon's army crosses the desert and learns the rhythm of Egypt. As the French expedition settled more deeply into Egypt, Napoleon soon realized that the land itself would become one of his greatest teachers. The desert stretched outward in vast, quiet expanses shaped by centuries of wind and sunlight. It carried a stillness that felt almost sacred, a kind of silence that encouraged contemplation rather than urgency. Every march, every encampment, and every sunrise introduced new lessons about survival, patience, and the profound weight of history in a place older than any structure in Europe. The crossing of the desert toward the Nile Valley marked a period of extraordinary adjustment for the soldiers. They were accustomed to the green fields of Italy, the forests of Austria, and the stone cities of France. Egypt presented something entirely different. In the early mornings, the sand carried a coolness that clung to their boots. The horizon glowed softly with pale gold light. As the sun rose higher, the warmth increased until it became an enveloping presence, steady and unavoidable. The soldiers traveled slowly, maintaining calm order under the shimmering sky. Napoleon rode near the front each day, his posture upright and steady. He observed how the men adapted to the climate. When he noticed any signs of fatigue, he adjusted the pace, encouraged rest, or called for water breaks. He understood that leadership in Egypt required a different rhythm. The desert could not be commanded with force. It could only be respected. The soldiers responded well to his quiet discipline. They trusted that he would guide them safely. The desert was not empty. It carried its own sounds and movements, subtle but constant. Wind brushed softly across dunes, lifting small grains of sand into gentle spirals. Birds circling high above created fleeting shadows across the ground. Occasionally, a caravan would appear in the distance, moving slowly along ancient trade paths. These caravans traveled with deliberate calm, their camels stepping rhythmically across the sand. The travelers often greeted the French soldiers with polite nods before continuing forward. Napoleon watched them carefully, recognizing in their movements a deep knowledge of the land. At night the desert transformed completely. The temperature cooled, bringing relief to tired bodies. The sky opened into an enormous canopy of stars, bright and steady. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a glowing arc. Lanterns flickered through the French camp, casting warm circles of light on the sand. Soldiers sat quietly in groups, speaking softly or resting in silence. The doctors tended to the faint or sun-weary. The scholars set up telescopes and notebooks, using the clarity of the desert sky to observe constellations and record celestial patterns. Napoleon often walked alone at night, accompanied by only a faint rustle of wind. He visited the edges of the camp to look out at the desert horizon. There, away from the sound of footsteps, he allowed himself a few moments of reflection. He thought about the weight of his responsibility, the challenges of leading men in unfamiliar surroundings, and the beauty of the world that stretched before him. He also considered the future of France. Even here, in the quiet shadow of the dunes, he found his thoughts drifting toward the administrative and political improvements France still needed. During the day, the march continued. The scholars frequently paused to collect samples of plants or minerals, sketch unusual rock formations, or examine ancient ruins half buried in sand. They were captivated by the subtle details of Egyptian desert life. Napoleon encouraged their curiosity. He believed that knowledge gained in Egypt would benefit not only science but also France's understanding of global culture. As they approached the Nile Valley, the landscape shifted in calming and beautiful ways. The first hint of the river appeared not in water but in life. A thin line of green emerged along the horizon. Palm trees rose gently above irrigated fields. The air carried a different scent, a soft mixture of moisture and growing plants. For soldiers who had spent weeks surrounded by sand, the sight of vegetation felt like a promise of comfort. When the expedition finally reached the river, the sight filled the entire army with quiet relief. The Nile flowed smoothly, reflecting the sky in gentle ripples. Its banks teemed with activity. Farmers guided oxen across damp soil. Fishermen paddled narrow boats along the water, their nets trailing behind them. Water birds gathered near the reeds, their wings creating small bursts of sound as they lifted into flight. Napoleon stood at the river bank for a long time, watching the water move with a timeless steadiness. He understood immediately that the Nile was not simply a geographic feature. It was the heart of Egyptian life. It had shaped kingdoms, nourished towns, and supported generations of families. Its annual flooding enriched the soil, making agriculture possible in an otherwise arid land. Napoleon respected the river deeply, recognizing its importance to the people who lived beside it. Once the army established temporary camps near the water, the soldiers rested, washed their clothes, and replenished their supplies. The clean water revived them. Their spirits rose. They felt a renewed sense of purpose. The scholars traveled along the river bank, examining ancient irrigation methods and documenting agricultural practices. They made sketches of boats, tools, and wildlife. Napoleon visited them frequently, asking quiet questions and noting their discoveries in a small journal. As the days passed, the expedition began to move along the Nile, traveling slowly from village to village. The people of these settlements observed the French with caution, curiosity, and occasional warmth. Napoleon approached them respectfully. He ensured that his officers enforced strict discipline. He issued proclamations in clear and gentle language, assuring the villagers that their customs and households would be respected. By maintaining calm order, he prevented unnecessary conflict. Napoleon also began implementing administrative reforms in regions now under French control. He encouraged fair tax collection, protection of local markets, and repairs to irrigation channels damaged by years of neglect. He assigned officials to oversee disputes and ensure stability. These changes were introduced gradually, with the intention of improving daily life rather than imposing foreign customs. The scholars, meanwhile, uncovered more and more traces of Egypt's ancient past. They studied crumbling temple walls, observed inscriptions carved into stone, and measured towering statues that had survived winds and floods for centuries. Their enthusiasm filled the camp with quiet excitement. Napoleon encouraged their findings, believing that the discoveries made during this expedition would deepen Europe's understanding of ancient history. At times, the soldiers found themselves camped beside ruins so old that their origins were barely understood. The temples rose silently from the sand, bathed in moonlight. The columns cast long shadows across the ground. The carvings, though weathered, retained a sense of careful artistry. Napoleon walked among these ruins at dusk, his footsteps soft, his thoughts reflective. He felt connected to the ancient rulers who had once governed these lands, not through conquest, but through shared awareness of responsibility and the passage of time. The desert taught the army patience. The Nile taught them nourishment. The ancient structures taught them humility. Together, these lessons shaped the expedition during its early months in Egypt. As Napoleon continued directing the march, he sensed that the work he was doing was preparing him for something larger, though he could not yet define what that might be. For now, he focused on the landscape before him, the well-being of his men, and the small but meaningful administrative improvements he was implementing. The sounds of evening returned each night, steady and gentle. The river whispered across its banks. The wind carried the faint rustle of palm leaves. Lanterns glowed like small islands of light across the camp. And Napoleon, seated at his writing table, recorded the day's observations with the same quiet discipline that defined every chapter of his life. In Part 13, we will drift deeper into the Egyptian campaign, exploring the early reforms Napoleon introduced, the first diplomatic challenges he faced, and the soothing yet complex rhythm of life along the Nile as the expedition settled more firmly into Egypt. Part 13. Calm governance along the Nile, Napoleon's early reforms and the gentle work of diplomacy. As the French expedition settled more firmly along the Nile, a new phase of Napoleon Bonaparte's journey began, one that required not the movements of armies, but the patient work of administration, listening, and careful diplomacy. The desert had tested endurance. The river had restored strength. Now Napoleon faced the delicate responsibility of guiding a foreign land with respect, stability, and an understanding of its ancient rhythms. It was not a chapter defined by battle, but by calm decision-making and quiet conversation, the kind that unfolds slowly and shapes events in subtle ways. Morning in the Nile Valley carried a softness that the soldiers had come to appreciate. The sunlight rose gently over the water, spreading across fields of barley and date groves. Oxen moved slowly through the shallows. The calls of fishermen drifted through the still air. Napoleon often observed these scenes as he prepared for the day's meetings and assessments. The peacefulness of the Nile mornings gave him time to reflect on the work ahead, which required more precision than force. The villages along the river, shaped by centuries of agricultural life, operated with traditions that predated even the oldest stone in the pyramids. Families lived according to seasonal rhythms. Priests offered prayers in quiet courtyards. Market stalls opened beneath canopies of woven palm leaves. To govern this land successfully, Napoleon understood that he must not disrupt its cultural foundations. Instead, he sought to support them, to bring order without imposing unfamiliar structures. His first reform focused on taxation. Many villages had suffered under inconsistent and sometimes exploitative practices. Napoleon introduced clearer systems, recorded in simple registers, ensuring that taxes were equal, predictable, and collected fairly. The work was slow. It required long conversations with local leaders, translators, and elders who understood the needs of their communities. Napoleon listened attentively, often leaning forward in his chair, hands folded, as they explained the challenges they faced. His calm manner reassured them. He did not rush their words. He let them describe their living patterns, harvest cycles, and family needs. From these conversations, he began shaping policies that respected local realities. The next reform involved the irrigation systems that fed the fertile land along the Nile. Years of conflict and political turmoil had left canals in disrepair. Napoleon recognized that restoring them was essential. He organized teams of engineers, soldiers, and local workers to clean channels clogged with silt, rebuild small stone embankments, and strengthen water gates. The work was quiet and methodical. Men waded into the water with baskets and tools. Children watched from the riverbank. The sound of flowing water grew stronger each day as the channels opened. Napoleon visited these work sites often. He walked slowly along the edges of the canals, stopping to examine the progress. He asked his engineers gentle questions about the soil, the angles of the channels, and the flow rate. He listened to the local farmers who explained how water should reach their fields at certain times of the year. These discussions shaped the improvements, creating a kind of partnership between French engineers and Egyptian villagers. Diplomacy also became central to this stage of the expedition. While some regions accepted the French presence with curiosity or neutrality, others approached it with caution. Napoleon responded with patience. He arranged meetings with religious leaders, elders, and respected figures within each community. These gatherings took place in shaded courtyards or inside quiet, stone-walled rooms. The air carried the scent of incense and warm earth. Translators stood nearby, relaying each thought with care. Napoleon began each meeting by acknowledging Egypt's ancient culture. He spoke softly, emphasizing that the French came not to undermine local traditions but to support order and reduce hardship. He assured the leaders that their religious practices and community customs would be respected. In return, he asked for cooperation, calm communication, and openness to new administrative methods. These conversations unfolded slowly, with pauses for reflection, tea, and the gentle nodding of agreement. Over time, many communities began to trust his intentions. The scholars, who had become an integral part of the expedition, contributed to this diplomatic atmosphere. They visited villages not as soldiers, but as observers of nature, architecture, and culture. They documented plants, drawn to the delicate shapes of lotus flowers and papyrus reeds. They measured ancient wells and studied irrigation tools used by farmers for generations. Their respectful presence reassured the villagers. They spoke with kindness, asked thoughtful questions, and shared sketches of their findings. Napoleon encouraged this work. He believed that understanding a land was the first step toward governing it responsibly. Evenings during this period carried a quiet rhythm of their own. Napoleon often returned to his tent at dusk, when lanterns were being lit across the camp and the last colors of the sunset reflected softly on the river. He reviewed reports from his officers, read letters from scholars describing ancient structures, and wrote instructions for the next day. The sounds of the night wrapped gently around the camp. Frogs croaked near the riverbank. Water lapped softly against the roots of date palms. The desert wind carried traces of coolness that eased the heat of the day. As he worked, Napoleon found himself reflecting often on the layers of history beneath his feet. Egypt had been home to powerful rulers, wise scholars, spiritual leaders, and countless families whose lives unfolded quietly along the Nile. The weight of that history encouraged him to act with thoughtfulness. He understood that every decree, every order, and every administrative choice shaped not only the French presence, but the daily lives of Egyptian communities. One of the most delicate responsibilities he faced involved balancing the needs of his own soldiers with those of the local people. Supplies had to be shared carefully, ensuring that the army had enough to function without straining village resources. Napoleon appointed officers to oversee food distribution, insisting on fairness and restraint. Conflicts were rare, and when they did arise, Napoleon addressed them immediately, meeting with villagers to ensure that misunderstandings were resolved gently. During these weeks, the French army also encountered ancient ruins that stirred the imagination. Massive stone structures rose from the sands. Carved columns cast long shadows across the ground. The scholars examined hieroglyphic inscriptions with patient devotion, copying each symbol with delicate brushes. Napoleon joined them occasionally, standing quietly beside fallen statues or partially buried walls. The air around these ruins felt different, as if it carried traces of the people who had once built them. Napoleon sensed the presence of a distant past, one that guided his understanding of Egypt and deepened his respect for its cultural richness. As the reforms progressed, the villages along the Nile began to show signs of renewed stability. Irrigation systems flowed more smoothly. Markets reopened with greater confidence. Farmers harvested their crops with fewer concerns about unpredictable taxation. Children returned to playing along the riverbanks. Napoleon observed these changes with quiet satisfaction. His goal had never been rapid transformation, but gradual improvement that aligned with local traditions. Diplomacy also continued to expand. Representatives from distant regions arrived to meet with Napoleon, often traveling for days along dusty roads or across stretches of calm river water. These meetings were gentle exchanges rather than tense negotiations. Napoleon listened to their concerns, answered with patience, and proposed solutions that balanced French administrative goals with Egyptian customs. Over time, these interactions created a fragile but real sense of cooperation. Throughout this period, the army's presence remained disciplined and respectful. Napoleon reminded his officers often that honor in Egypt depended on restraint. He believed deeply that France's success rested not only on military strength, but on moral conduct. This vision shaped the behavior of his men, who gradually learned to adapt to the pace and culture of the land they now walked upon. Toward the end of this chapter, Napoleon felt that the expedition had reached a moment of calm, where the essential rhythms of Egyptian life continued undisturbed and where French reforms had begun to take root. He knew that challenges still lay ahead. Yet he also sensed that the work he was doing now, steady and thoughtful, would echo far beyond the present moment. In Part 14, we will drift into the more complex diplomatic currents that soon surrounded the expedition, exploring the alliances, quiet tensions, and shifting influences that shaped Napoleon's understanding of Egypt and the broader world. Part 14. Whispers across the desert, diplomacy, intrigue, and the quiet shifting of influence. As the months passed along the Nile, Napoleon found that Egypt was not only a land of ancient monuments and peaceful riverbanks, but also a place where politics and quiet intrigue moved through the air like a subtle breeze. The French expedition had settled into its administrative routines. Irrigation channels flowed smoothly. Markets reopened. Scholars continued their patient studies of ruins and hieroglyphics. Soldiers adapted to the climate and to the gentle daily rhythms of life along the water. Yet beneath this calm surface, quiet currents of diplomacy began to form, unfolding slowly like the movement of the Nile itself. Not all of these currents were visible. Some existed in soft conversations exchanged inside shaded courtyards, where elders met with French officials to discuss local disputes. Others traveled through letters delivered by quiet messengers who moved between distant villages and regional leaders. Some currents grew from curiosity, others from caution, a few from unspoken hope that the French presence might bring stability after long periods of uncertainty. Napoleon approached each new piece of information with patience. He never rushed to conclusions. Each morning, after standing on the riverbank to observe the soft rise of sunlight over the water, he returned to his command tent to read reports from various regions. The tent was quiet, lit by warm daylight filtering through canvas walls. The rustle of palm leaves created a soft rhythm outside. Napoleon's writing table was arranged neatly with scrolls, notes, and carefully folded maps. As he read, he tapped his finger lightly on the wood, thinking through each detail. Among the first matters requiring delicate handling were the shifting attitudes of local leaders. Some had accepted the French presence with relative ease, appreciating the repairs to canals and improvements in tax fairness. Others remained cautious, unsure how long the occupation would last or what its impact would be. A few listened for news from distant regions, wondering whether larger powers might intervene. Napoleon understood that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned slowly. He instructed his officers to treat every meeting with respect and restraint. He reminded them that each elder, priest, or village representative carried centuries of cultural memory. A single conversation could shape the feelings of an entire community. And so, these meetings became gentle rituals of diplomacy. In many villages, the French were invited to sit beneath palm leaf awnings or inside mud brick halls. The air carried the soothing scent of date syrup warming in small clay pots. Hosts poured tea into simple cups, offering them with steady hands. Translators stood quietly nearby, ensuring every word moved across the table with clarity. Napoleon began each discussion by asking about local concerns. He encouraged the leaders to describe agricultural needs, family customs, seasonal festivals, and past difficulties with taxation or governance. He listened with genuine attention, his posture steady, his expression thoughtful. These quiet exchanges revealed not only the needs of the villages, but the deeper cultural foundations that guided Egyptian life. Napoleon absorbed these details patiently, understanding that effective governance required far more than military presence. Beyond these local matters, larger diplomatic currents began to shape the landscape. News traveled slowly, but not silently. Rumors reached the French encampments that rival European powers watched the Egypt expedition carefully. The Ottoman Empire, which still held nominal sovereignty over Egypt, was said to be weighing its response. British ships patrolled portions of the Mediterranean. Traders and travelers whispered about shifting alliances. Some of these stories were exaggerated by distance. Some were rooted in truth. Napoleon sifted through each fragment of information with calm analysis. He knew that Egypt held a unique strategic position. Its cities, its river, its long coastline, and its ancient trade routes made it a place of interest for many powers. Yet Napoleon refused to let uncertainty distract him from his immediate responsibilities. He continued strengthening administrative systems, supporting the scholars, and addressing local concerns. His conviction was simple. Stability within Egypt would prepare the expedition to face any external challenges with confidence. During these months, the scholars played an unexpectedly important diplomatic role. Their genuine curiosity about Egyptian life encouraged friendly interactions with villagers who might otherwise have remained wary. When a scholar stood patiently in a field sketching a wooden water wheel or describing the texture of a papyrus plant, local children gathered around with quiet interest. Their parents watched from a distance, eventually approaching to join the conversation. These small moments softened tensions and built bridges between communities. Many evenings, the scholars shared their discoveries with Napoleon. They brought carefully inked sketches of temples half buried in sand. They showed him measurements of ancient canals, lists of birds and insects, or translations of inscriptions found on weathered stone blocks. Napoleon read their reports with calm admiration. He often discussed the findings with them by lantern light, asking questions not out of obligation, but out of genuine interest. The scholars' enthusiasm created a gentle sense of purpose throughout the expedition. Diplomacy also unfolded in the quiet interactions between soldiers and villagers. When soldiers purchased dates or grains at local markets, they did so with controlled courtesy. Napoleon required strict discipline to ensure that no soldier misused authority. Over time, the villagers noticed this restraint. They offered goods with increasing ease, understanding that trade could flourish under these conditions. Children learned to smile at passing French patrols. Bakers greeted officers with polite nods. These small gestures signaled the beginnings of trust. Still, larger concerns remained. Napoleon kept close attention on rumors of shifting Ottoman attitudes. When letters arrived from distant regions describing new movements of Ottoman forces, Napoleon read them carefully. He never responded with haste. Instead, he consulted his maps, discussed the situation with advisors, and reviewed the positions of French troops stationed in various villages. Even in moments of uncertainty, his tone remained calm. Officers observed this behavior with respect, learning that steady leadership was more reassuring than any display of force. Nighttime during this chapter of the expedition carried its own quiet atmosphere. The camps glowed softly with lanterns. Soldiers rested on woven mats beside small cooking fires. The scholars organized their notes beneath the dim light of candles. The Nile flowed steadily, its surface reflecting the stars in gentle shimmering patterns. Napoleon often sat outside his tent at these hours, taking notes while listening to the sounds of the camp. The scent of worn sand and faint traces of spice drifted through the air. These nights encouraged reflection, allowing Napoleon to think deeply about the complexity of governing a land so rich in history. He realized that Egypt was not only a physical landscape, but a cultural and emotional one as well. It required a leadership style built on respect, clarity, and patience. It was a place where messages traveled more effectively through quiet conversations than through formal declarations. And it was a place where every stone, every field, and every shoreline carried memories of civilizations long past. In the midst of these reflections, Napoleon came to understand something profound. His work in Egypt was teaching him lessons about leadership that no battlefield could offer. He was learning how to guide people whose customs were different from his own. He was learning how to create stability without relying solely on military structure. And he was learning how to listen to voices that spoke with wisdom shaped over thousands of years. This chapter of diplomacy, quiet influence, and gentle cooperation marked an important turning point in the expedition. It gave Napoleon a deeper understanding of the land, strengthened relationships with local communities, and prepared him for the greater political challenges that would soon arise beyond the Nile Valley. In Part 15, we will continue drifting through the Egyptian campaign, exploring the growing awareness of European rivalries, the calm but persistent concerns surrounding foreign intervention, and the deepening connection between Napoleon and the scholars who accompanied him. Part 15. Rivalries in the distance, quiet tensions, soft warnings, and the scholars who lit the nights. As the French presence along the Nile continued to grow more stable, Napoleon became increasingly aware of faint yet persistent signals that the wider world was beginning to stir. Egypt, so calm in its daily rhythms, was nevertheless watched quietly by other powers whose interests stretched across seas and deserts. These distant rivalries reached the expedition not through sudden alarms, but through soft murmurs carried by letters, travelers, and quiet diplomatic messages. Each one arrived with the gentle weight of possibility rather than immediate threat. The days themselves remained peaceful. Morning sunlight still glowed across the river. Farmers moved through their fields with the same ancient steadiness. Markets opened beneath shaded canopies, filled with the scents of spice, herbs, and warm bread. Soldiers continued their regular patrols, now accustomed to the new rhythms of Egyptian life. The scholars filled notebooks with careful sketches of temples, plants, and astronomical observations. On the surface, everything seemed calm. Yet Napoleon sensed that the horizon was beginning to shift. It began with a letter, carried by a courier who had traveled for days along quiet roads. The message described distant movements of the British fleet in the Mediterranean. It was written with cautious wording, neither urgent nor dismissive. Napoleon read it slowly, seated at his writing table near the riverbank. The sound of water brushing gently against the shore accompanied his thoughts. He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside his maps. He did not outwardly show concern. Instead, he allowed the information to rest in his mind, where it would shape his decisions only when the correct moment arrived. In the days that followed, more reports reached the camp. Some travelers described seeing ships near certain ports. Others mentioned that envoys from the Ottoman Empire were growing increasingly uneasy about the French presence. These murmurs did not disrupt the expedition, but they added a soft layer of anticipation to Napoleon's thinking. He understood that every great undertaking carried a period of calm before a turning point. He recognized that the Egyptian campaign was slowly approaching such a moment. Still, he refused to let uncertainty overshadow the work at hand. Napoleon continued his daily routine of walking through villages, speaking with elders, overseeing repairs, and observing the scholars. His presence brought a sense of stability not only to his officers, but also to the local residents. Even as the political horizon shifted, the day-to-day life along the Nile remained wrapped in an atmosphere of quiet cooperation. The scholars in particular became a comforting presence during this period. Their dedication to learning brought lightness to the evenings, even when the days carried hints of unease. As the sun set and the desert wind cooled the air, small gatherings formed around their tables. Lanterns glowed softly. Scrolls lay open. Brushes and instruments reflected flickers of golden light. Napoleon often joined them, drawn to the gentle calm of their discussions. They spoke of ancient astronomy, the structure of Egyptian temples, patterns in the stars, and discoveries made beneath layers of sand. They described the meaning of hieroglyphs, the symbolism of statues, and the engineering behind monumental stone constructions. Their enthusiasm lifted the atmosphere of the camp. Napoleon found their passion refreshing. It reminded him that knowledge, curiosity, and the pursuit of understanding could continue even as political uncertainties gathered in the background. One evening, as the scholars prepared their telescopes near the riverbank, Napoleon stood beside them inside a quiet circle of lamplight. The stars shone brilliantly overhead. The sky was clear and deep. The water reflected the constellations in shimmering patterns. The scholars explained the position of the planets, the brightness of certain stars, and their theories about celestial movements observed through Egyptian history. Napoleon listened with steady attention. The vastness of the night sky often reminded him that the concerns of nations, while important, were only a small part of the world's grand design. This perspective soothed him. It softened the edges of diplomatic tension and allowed him to approach decisions with patience rather than urgency. During this stage of the expedition, Napoleon also strengthened the internal structure of the French administration in Egypt. He appointed officers with calm authority, ensuring each region had a representative who understood both French goals and Egyptian customs. He emphasized fairness in all administrative matters. He insisted that supplies be distributed carefully and that soldiers maintain discipline in their interactions with local communities. These measures reinforced the expedition's stability, allowing the people of Egypt to continue their daily routines with fewer disruptions. Farmers trusted that their crops would be protected. Artisans felt secure in their markets. Families grew more comfortable approaching French officials with questions or concerns. Napoleon understood that these small elements of trust would become essential if the political climate changed. Whispers of British interest in Egypt continued to arrive, yet Napoleon responded with quiet confidence. He knew that strength did not always come from displays of force. Often it was rooted in steady leadership, clear communication, and an understanding of the land one sought to protect. As he reviewed maps each evening, he measured not only distances and terrain, but also the morale of his soldiers and the sentiment of the communities around them. The occasional diplomatic message from the Ottoman Empire also reached the camp, delivered through intermediaries who spoke cautiously. These messages contained hints of discomfort, expressions of concern, and attempts at clarification. Napoleon read each one with calm attention. He recognized the delicate balance between the Ottoman government, local Egyptian leaders, and the French presence. He responded with thoughtful, respectful language, seeking to reduce tension rather than provoke conflict. Even with these emerging signals, life along the Nile continued with a soothing steadiness. The river flowed gently every morning. The fields grew green under the soft sunlight. The wind moved through the palm groves with a rustling hush. Soldiers trained quietly along the water's edge. The scholars documented ancient inscriptions beneath shaded porticos. Children ran along the banks and paused to watch the French boats drift past. This peaceful background allowed Napoleon to think clearly. He recognized that diplomacy required patience, and that not every warning sign demanded immediate reaction. He believed that calm preparation was far more powerful than hurried action. So he reviewed supply lines, strengthened communications between French posts, and ensured that officers understood both their responsibilities and the cultural sensitivity required in Egypt. One of the most meaningful aspects of this period was the deepening bond between Napoleon and the scholars. Their conversations offered him perspective. Their discoveries renewed his sense of purpose. Their devotion to understanding Egypt reminded him that his expedition was not only a military mission, but also a journey of learning and connection between civilizations. This bond helped sustain the entire expedition during the quiet tension that gradually formed in the air. Uncertainty did not vanish, but it softened under the influence of knowledge, curiosity, and calm leadership. As Part 15 comes to a close, the stage is set for a gentle but significant shift in the campaign. Napoleon now stands with deeper understanding, stronger administrative structures, and a growing sense that the next chapter will involve navigating the delicate boundary between diplomacy and conflict. In Part 16, we will move quietly into these rising tensions, exploring how Napoleon responded to the first clear signs of confrontation while maintaining the same steady, thoughtful approach that defined his leadership in Egypt. Part 16. Calm before the storm. The first clear signs of conflict and Napoleon's quiet preparations. As the Egyptian sun continued to rise each morning in warm, steady brilliance, the French expedition enjoyed a period of relative peace. The Nile flowed with its familiar rhythm. Markets continued to open with quiet chatter. Scholars recorded ancient wonders with the same gentle devotion that had guided them from the day they arrived. To the casual observer, nothing appeared amiss. The land maintained its daily harmony. Yet beneath this calm surface, Napoleon sensed a subtle shift, like a faint ripple moving through still water. The reports arriving from distant regions had grown more consistent. They described movements of unfamiliar cavalry, increased communication among tribal leaders, and the arrival of messengers whose intentions were difficult to interpret. These messages were not alarming, but they were steady. Each carried a small piece of a larger pattern. Napoleon understood the meaning behind these gentle signals. A confrontation was approaching. Not abruptly, and not dangerously close, but slowly, like a distant tide beginning to rise. He approached this development not with fear, but with careful thought. Each morning, after a quiet moment observing the golden reflection of dawn on the Nile, Napoleon returned to his writing table. The table was simple, made of wood polished smooth by months of use. His maps lay neatly arranged, weighed down by small stones collected from the desert. Reports were stacked beside them in organized rows. As he read through each update, his expression remained composed. He noted the details he needed and set aside the ones shaped by rumor rather than fact. Outside, the camp stirred to life in soft rhythms. Soldiers cleaned their weapons, mended uniforms, and checked supply packs. Officers reviewed their lists while standing under the shade of large canvas awnings. The smell of bread baking over small fires drifted through the air. It was a scene of quiet readiness rather than urgency. Napoleon's first step was to strengthen communication between the French posts scattered along the Nile. Riders were assigned to new routes, ensuring that messages could travel without delay. Supply lines were inspected to confirm that food, water, and medicine were available in sufficient quantities. These adjustments were made gently, without disrupting the normal pace of life. The soldiers understood that such preparations were simply part of good leadership. Next, Napoleon began meeting with key officers in the evenings. These gatherings were peaceful discussions held under lantern light. The desert air cooled pleasantly after sunset. The officers sat in a circle, their faces softly illuminated as they reviewed the situation. Napoleon spoke with calm clarity. He explained the significance of each new report. He emphasized the importance of patience, discipline, and readiness. His tone reassured rather than alarmed. The officers left these meetings with a clear sense of direction. The scholars, who had become trusted companions as well as intellectual contributors, were not left unaware of the changing atmosphere. Although their work continued at its usual pace, many of them sensed that Napoleon's attention was divided between administrative tasks and careful preparation. Yet the scholars' devotion to their studies remained a source of comfort for the entire camp. Their discoveries reminded everyone that Egypt offered not only challenges, but also knowledge, wisdom, and inspiration. One evening, a group of scholars invited Napoleon to observe a newly uncovered wall of inscriptions beside a partially excavated temple. The lanterns cast a soft glow on the carved symbols. The air carried a faint sense of ancient fragrance, like dust warmed gently by time. Napoleon stood silently, tracing the lines of hieroglyphs with his eyes. The scholars explained that the symbols described the reign of an ancient pharaoh, one who had faced his own period of uncertainty but led with strength and patience. Napoleon listened quietly, understanding the subtle relevance of their discovery. The presence of these inscriptions reminded him that leadership often required steady vision through uncertain circumstances. Egypt had witnessed countless eras of change. His expedition was only one moment within a vast timeline. As the days passed, Napoleon made additional preparations, though always with a gentle touch. He ensured that cavalry units were positioned near key routes. He spoke with engineers about reinforcing small fortifications near important river crossings. He reviewed the training routines of soldiers stationed farther south. Yet he never allowed these actions to disrupt the peaceful routines of the villages under French administration. The local communities noticed these changes in small ways. They saw more frequent patrols, but the soldiers moved with the same respectful discipline as before. They noticed French officials examining roads and storage houses, but they did so calmly and without imposing on families or businesses. Napoleon understood the importance of maintaining trust even as he prepared for potential difficulties. He wanted the villagers to feel secure, not frightened. During this time, Napoleon held several gentle diplomatic meetings with local leaders. These gatherings took place in the same shaded courtyards where earlier discussions had built foundations of cooperation. The leaders expressed quiet concerns about the rumors they had heard from distant regions. Napoleon listened carefully. He assured them that the French presence remained committed to stability. He explained that his preparations were meant to ensure peace, not provoke conflict. His calm voice eased their worries. As part of these efforts, Napoleon revisited his policy regarding fairness and respect toward local customs. He reminded his officers that the trust built over the past months was valuable. Every interaction mattered. Every decision shaped the way communities perceived the French presence. His officers understood this deeply and continued to enforce discipline and restraint within the ranks. One of the most meaningful moments of this chapter came on a night when the desert sky felt particularly vast and clear. Napoleon stood alone near the edge of the camp, gazing upward. The stars shimmered with unusual sharpness, forming patterns that seemed to stretch endlessly. The cool wind brushed gently across his face. He reflected on the journey that had brought him to Egypt. He thought about the responsibilities of leadership, the fragile balance between peace and preparation, and the quiet strength required to guide an expedition through both. The silence around him felt almost sacred. It reminded him that even great leaders must stand in stillness at times, listening to the quiet guidance of the world around them. The desert, with its ancient history and deep calm, had taught him that strength did not always manifest in motion. Sometimes it appeared in the willingness to wait, observe, and act only when the moment was right. During the next few days, the first clear signs of confrontation grew closer. A group of scouts returned with reports that matched some of the earlier rumors. They described gatherings of troops in distant regions, small but organized. Napoleon received them in his tent, listening with steady attention. When the scouts finished, he thanked them for their work and sent them to rest. Then he sat alone for a moment, letting the information settle into his thoughts. The quiet hum of the camp surrounded him. Lanterns flickered softly. The far-off sound of soldiers walking their late patrols drifted through the warm night air. Napoleon felt no fear, only clarity. The coming challenges were part of the larger path he had chosen. He knew that his next steps would define the stability of the entire expedition. In Part 17, we will move peacefully into the next stage of the Egyptian campaign, where the approaching conflict finally begins to take shape, and Napoleon responds with the same calm, thoughtful leadership that had carried him across deserts, riverbanks, and ancient landscapes. Part 17. The desert stirs, soft footsteps toward conflict and the quiet strength of Napoleon's leadership. In the days that followed the first clear reports from the scouts, a subtle shift settled across the French encampments along the Nile. Life continued much as it had before. Bread still baked over small morning fires. Soldiers still performed their calm routines. Scholars still measured the height of temple walls and examined ancient ceramics with careful fingertips. Villagers still guided oxen through the fields, their steps slow and steady in the warm earth. Yet beneath all of this familiar activity, there existed a quiet sense of anticipation. It was not fear. It was not agitation. It was more like the stillness that gently gathers in the air before the first soft rainfall. The French soldiers noticed it when they paused during patrols and listened to the distant wind over the dunes. Officers sensed it when they met with Napoleon each evening and observed the thoughtful way he examined new reports. Even the scholars felt it, although their work continued with the same quiet diligence. They noted the change in the tone of the officers' footsteps, or in the slightly shorter conversations during mealtimes. Egypt, which had embraced the expedition with calm rhythms, now seemed to breathe a little differently. Napoleon remained the steady center of this atmosphere. Each morning, he stood beside the Nile, watching the gentle movement of water against the reeds. He allowed the quiet scenery to settle him before the day's responsibilities began. The river glowed softly in the early light. Birds flew low over the surface, creating ripples that expanded and faded with the rhythms of nature. In these moments, Napoleon gathered his thoughts and prepared himself for what the coming weeks would require. The scouts' reports grew more detailed. They described clusters of Ottoman cavalry assembling farther south, beyond the immediate reach of French patrols. They mentioned alliances forming among leaders who felt uneasy about France's continued presence in Egypt. They noted increased communication among tribal groups who usually remained independent from one another. These were not signs of immediate danger, but they formed a pattern that Napoleon could not ignore. He responded with careful preparation rather than haste. One of his first actions was to strengthen the positions of the French outposts along the river. These outposts, located near villages and important crossings, provided both protection and stability. Napoleon instructed officers to reinforce walls with additional stone and wood, to check the water supplies stored in clay jars, and to verify that every station had adequate medical provisions. He also ordered additional training sessions for the infantry and cavalry. These drills were calm and methodical. Soldiers practiced moving in formation under the warm sunlight. They reviewed signals, prepared mounts, and familiarized themselves with the terrain. Napoleon often watched these sessions from a shaded spot near the riverbank. He observed the discipline of his troops, the precision of their movements, and the quiet confidence that grew among them. The scholars, aware of the increased activity, approached their daily work with even greater focus. They understood that the knowledge they gathered might soon become part of Europe's understanding of Egypt's ancient world. Their sketches, measurements, and written passages offered comfort to the soldiers, who appreciated the scholars' continued presence. It reminded them that the expedition existed not only for military purposes, but also for learning, discovery, and cultural understanding. Napoleon continued meeting with local leaders as well. He held these gatherings with the same soft-spoken respect that had shaped earlier diplomacy. The leaders welcomed him beneath awnings woven from palm leaves or inside cool stone halls that protected them from the heat. They voiced their concerns quietly. Some had heard rumors of approaching troops. Others were unsure how long the peaceful balance would last. Napoleon assured them that the French presence remained committed to maintaining order. He expressed appreciation for their cooperation and promised that their traditions would continue to be respected. These meetings provided Napoleon with important insights. The local leaders understood the land in ways that foreigners could not. They spoke of seasonal patterns, shifting alliances, and ancient routes that connected distant regions. Their knowledge allowed Napoleon to shape his preparations with greater accuracy. During the evenings, the officers met with Napoleon to review the latest developments. The gatherings were calm and thoughtful. A few lanterns hung between the tents, casting gentle light across their maps. The smell of warm sand mixed with the faint scent of desert herbs carried by the breeze. Napoleon's voice remained steady as he explained the significance of each new piece of information. He reminded his officers that discipline and clarity mattered more than rapid action. It was during one of these evening gatherings that Napoleon introduced a new plan. The plan involved preparing a quiet movement of troops toward regions that might experience the first signs of tension. Rather than waiting for conflict to reach the Nile Valley, Napoleon preferred to understand the shifting situation directly. He selected officers who were calm, perceptive, and respectful. Their mission would be not only to gather information, but also to reassure local communities and maintain a sense of stability. The chosen officers understood the importance of their assignment. They prepared their units with care, gathering supplies, checking their horses, and organizing small carts for water storage. The soldiers assigned to these units felt neither worried nor hurried. They knew that their leader understood the land and would guide them through it with steady hands. While these preparations unfolded, Napoleon found himself reflecting often during the quiet hours of the night. He would walk alone along the edge of the camp, listening to the soft movement of the river and the faint hum of insects. The stars shimmered overhead in vast constellations. The desert breeze carried a soothing coolness. In these moments, he thought about the delicate balance between peace and readiness. He understood that leadership meant guiding others through uncertainty without allowing fear to take hold. He also thought of the responsibility he held, not only to the French soldiers who followed him, but also to the Egyptian communities who looked to him for stability. He knew that his decisions would shape the lives of countless families. This awareness filled him not with anxiety, but with a calm determination. Over time, the soft signs of approaching conflict grew slightly clearer. French patrols observed distant movements along the horizon. Local traders reported seeing unfamiliar banners in regions farther south. Small groups of riders passed near the edges of village fields, leaving faint tracks in the sand. None of these signs were immediate threats, but together they painted a picture of momentum. Napoleon responded with a gentle but decisive shift in strategy. He instructed his officers to maintain their routines, but to approach every task with heightened awareness. He ordered that messages be transported more frequently between outposts. He requested daily updates from the scholars, not because their work was related to military matters, but because their presence and insights anchored the expedition in stability. Interestingly, it was the scholars who provided one of the most meaningful sources of calm during this period. Their discoveries, conversations, and simple wonder at Egypt's ancient structures reminded everyone that the expedition had come here for something larger than conflict. Their gentle presence balanced the tension that quietly gathered around the edges of the campaign. Villagers continued their daily routines, reassured by the consistent kindness shown by French officers and soldiers. Life along the Nile did not stop. Boats still drifted along the water in the early mornings. Families still gathered in courtyards during the warm evenings. Children still played near the fields, their laughter carrying softly through the air. Napoleon understood the importance of preserving this atmosphere. He allowed the expedition to prepare while maintaining the calmness that defined its presence. As this chapter of the Egyptian campaign draws to a close, the stage is set for the first meaningful tests of Napoleon's leadership in the face of rising tension. He stands ready, thoughtful, and patient, guided by the silent lessons of the desert and the steady movement of the Nile. In Part 18, we will move gently into the first quiet confrontations of the campaign, exploring how Napoleon approached these moments with the same steady, reflective leadership that had carried him through every challenge so far. Part 18. First gentle confrontations, a calm march into uncertainty and the quiet resolve of the army. The first stirrings of conflict reached the French expedition not as sudden alarms, but as soft, steady signals carried from the edges of the desert. For months, Napoleon and his officers had sensed the distant movement of opposing forces, like faint ripples touching the banks of the Nile. Now, those ripples began to form clearer patterns. Yet even as tension grew, the atmosphere within the French camp remained calm. The soldiers moved with quiet confidence. Officers reviewed their plans under shaded awnings. Scholars continued their work with the same gentle enthusiasm. Life along the river continued to flow with its familiar rhythm. It was during a warm morning, when a pale golden light floated above the palm trees, that a group of scouts returned with a detailed report. They dismounted beside Napoleon's tent, their horses covered in fine desert dust. Their expressions were serious but composed. Napoleon listened to their description of small enemy detachments gathering near distant villages. These were early signs, not of a great battle, but of cautious probing and observation. Napoleon thanked the scouts and allowed them to rest. Then he stepped outside his tent, taking a moment to observe the calm surface of the Nile. The river flowed steadily, unaware of the political shifts gathering beyond the horizon. Birds glided across the water. A fisherman cast his net in a graceful arc. Everything appeared peaceful, yet Napoleon understood that a change was approaching. The quietness did not worry him. It simply reminded him that leadership required a steady heart. In the following days, he met with his officers each evening. They sat in a gentle circle beneath lanterns that cast warm light on their faces. The sound of the desert breeze moved softly across the sand. Napoleon explained that they would soon begin a careful march toward the regions where the scouts had observed suspicious activity. The officers listened with calm focus. They trusted that their leader would guide them with the same clarity that had shaped every decision since the expedition began. Napoleon emphasized that this march was not intended as a show of force, but as a careful movement meant to observe, understand, and reassure local populations who felt uncertain. His tone remained even. His voice carried confidence, not urgency. The officers left the meeting feeling grounded. The next morning, preparations began quietly. Soldiers packed water, repaired saddles, and checked their firearms. Supplies were loaded onto small carts. Horses were brushed and bridled. The air carried the scent of warm hay and dust. Although the soldiers understood the purpose of the march, they moved without anxiety. Napoleon had taught them that fear had no place in a disciplined force. Their trust in his leadership offered steady reassurance. Before departing, Napoleon visited the scholars. They gathered under a date palm grove, surrounded by baskets filled with scrolls and clay tablets they had discovered during recent excavations. The scholars asked Napoleon whether the march would disrupt their studies. He assured them that they should continue their work at a comfortable pace. Their role, he told them, was to illuminate the past, not to follow the movements of armies. The scholars nodded with gratitude. Their calm presence grounded the soldiers. Napoleon believed that their work held meaning beyond the immediate concerns of the campaign, and he wished to protect it as much as possible. When the march began, it unfolded with slow, deliberate movements. The sun rose gently above the desert, casting long shadows across the sand. The French column moved in quiet formation, accompanied by the soft sound of boots pressing into the earth and horses breathing steadily. There was no shouting, no hurried steps. The army advanced as if part of the natural environment, moving with the rhythm of the land. As they traveled farther from the Nile, the landscape shifted. Date palms gave way to open stretches of sand. The air grew warmer. Distant hills shimmered in the heat. The desert silence became deeper, almost meditative. Napoleon rode near the front, observing the land with thoughtful attention. The soldiers behind him maintained calm order, their movements slow and purposeful. After several hours of marching, the army passed through a small village. The residents watched quietly from doorways and rooftops. Some recognized the French soldiers and knew of their respectful behavior in other regions. They offered cautious waves or polite nods. Napoleon dismounted and approached a group of elders. He greeted them with calm courtesy. Through a translator, he asked about recent events in the village. The elders explained that riders had passed through during the night, asking questions about the French presence. They did not describe these riders as threatening, but their unexpected arrival had unsettled them. Napoleon listened carefully. He thanked the elders for their honesty and assured them that the French expedition would ensure their safety. His voice carried warmth and respect. The elders seemed reassured. These quiet conversations helped Napoleon understand the subtle movements of opposing forces across the land. They also strengthened bonds with the village residents, whose knowledge was invaluable. The march continued toward a region where scouts had reported signs of organized activity. As the army approached, they observed scattered footprints across the sand, faint but telling. Napoleon instructed his officers to proceed slowly. He did not wish to alarm anyone or provoke unnecessary confrontation. Near sunset, the French reached an open plateau overlooking a wide stretch of desert. The sky glowed with soft hues of rose and amber. The air cooled gently. From this vantage point, the soldiers could see small clusters of distant figures moving across the horizon. They were too far away to identify, but they moved with the discipline of trained riders. Napoleon studied them silently. His officers watched him, waiting for his assessment. After a long moment, Napoleon concluded that these movements were exploratory rather than aggressive. The opposing forces were gathering information, just as the French were. It was a quiet dance of observation, common in the early stages of conflict. Napoleon instructed his officers to set up a temporary camp on the plateau. The soldiers erected tents in neat rows as lanterns flickered to life. Fires were lit for cooking simple meals. The desert night settled around them with cooling breezes and the gentle rustle of sand. The distant riders disappeared over the horizon. As the soldiers rested, Napoleon walked alone to the edge of the plateau. He looked out at the moonlit expanse. The desert seemed endless. The stars shimmered like scattered jewels across the night sky. The air felt calm, almost sacred. In this quiet moment, Napoleon reflected on the nature of conflict. He understood that true strength did not lie in eagerness for confrontation, but in the ability to remain steady and thoughtful even as tensions rose. He returned to the camp and wrote notes by lantern light. He recorded the positions of the distant riders, the impressions gathered from the village elders, and the subtle changes in the political landscape. His handwriting was precise and unhurried. These notes would guide the next steps of the expedition. During the night, small patrols moved quietly around the edges of the camp. They found no signs of immediate danger. The desert remained still, illuminated by moonlight and starlight. The soldiers slept deeply, tired from the day's journey but comforted by the atmosphere of calm leadership. By morning, Napoleon felt that he understood the situation more clearly. The opposing forces were assembling, but not yet prepared for direct engagement. This stage required patience, observation, and calm readiness. He gave instructions for the army to continue its slow march toward another region where signs of movement had been reported. He also arranged for additional scouts to travel ahead, ensuring that the French would always understand the terrain and the intentions of those who moved within it. As the army set out again, the soft morning light bathed the desert in warmth. Napoleon felt a quiet confidence. The coming weeks would involve important decisions, but he believed that his steady approach would guide the expedition through whatever challenges lay ahead. In Part 19, we will follow Napoleon as the first meaningful contact with opposing forces occurs, shaped not by chaos, but by controlled strength, quiet observation, and the gentle wisdom he had gathered during his time in Egypt. Part 19. A gentle meeting of forces, quiet resolve on the edges of the desert. The first meaningful contact between the French expedition and the distant forces watching them came not as a clash, but as a quiet moment on the edges of the desert. For many weeks, Napoleon had prepared his soldiers with calm discipline, guiding them through gentle marches, thoughtful planning, and careful observation. Now, as the soft light of early morning spread across the sand, he sensed that the time had come for the two sides to acknowledge one another. The camp awakened slowly. The air still held the cool touch of night. Soldiers stepped from their tents with unhurried movements, stretching their limbs, adjusting their garments, and preparing simple breakfasts. The smell of warm flatbread, dates, and boiled grains drifted through the still air. Officers spoke in quiet tones. Lanterns were extinguished one by one as sunlight replaced their glow. Napoleon stood near the edge of the plateau where they had camped since the previous evening. The horizon was painted with soft hues of gold and rose. The desert ahead stretched endlessly, yet in that vastness, faint silhouettes began to appear. A small group of mounted riders approached slowly from the distance. They moved with careful, deliberate steps, not in formation for attack, but in the controlled posture of scouts or envoys. Napoleon signaled to his officers to maintain position. No commands of urgency were given. The soldiers continued their morning tasks, aware of the approaching figures but not alarmed. The calmness of the French camp contrasted with the uncertainty of the desert beyond. This steadiness reflected Napoleon's leadership. He believed that peace of mind was as valuable as strength. The riders drew closer until their features became clearer. They wore garments shaped by the desert climate, fabrics flowing gently around them. Their horses moved with that same smooth steadiness common among experienced desert travelers. As they approached, they halted at a respectful distance from the French line. The atmosphere was quiet. The wind shifted softly, moving sand in small spirals. A few French officers stepped forward, accompanied by a translator. Napoleon remained slightly behind them, observing with thoughtful interest. He preferred to understand first, to listen before speaking. Every gesture in this moment held meaning, and he intended to proceed with the same respect he had shown the Egyptian communities. The lead rider spoke first. His voice carried across the space with a calm tone. Through the translator, he explained that they came representing leaders who had watched the French presence with growing interest and concern. He described how many communities were unsure what the future held. Some feared instability. Others hoped for reassurance. Napoleon stepped forward. The desert light illuminated his face gently. He greeted the riders with steady respect. His voice remained soft, yet firm. He explained that the French expedition had come not to disrupt the balance of the land, but to bring stability where uncertainty had grown for years. He spoke of rebuilding canals, supporting markets, and resolving disputes peacefully. The riders listened with careful attention. Their expressions softened slightly. They exchanged brief glances, as if processing the sincerity of Napoleon's words. Then their leader asked a question that lingered in the warm air. He wanted to know whether the French intended to remain permanently or whether their presence was temporary. Napoleon answered with thoughtful balance. He explained that France had a responsibility to establish order, but also a deep respect for Egypt's ancient culture. He expressed that his interest lay in cooperation, not domination. He wished to learn from Egypt's history, to appreciate its traditions, and to work with its people rather than against them. The conversation continued with gentle deliberation. The riders shared stories of distant regions where groups had begun preparing for possible conflict. Napoleon listened closely. He recognized that their words were not threats, but warnings born from uncertainty. These riders themselves seemed caught between the shifting decisions of regional leaders and the calm stability they witnessed in the French camp. After some time, Napoleon thanked them for their honesty. He asked them to carry his message of respect and stability back to their communities. His voice carried quiet authority, not through force, but through the clarity of intention. The riders nodded, accepting the responsibility. Before departing, the riders expressed admiration for the scholars who had been studying Egypt's ancient sites. They said that news of these scholars had reached their distant communities. This small detail brought a soft smile to Napoleon's face. It reminded him that knowledge and curiosity had the power to build bridges even during tense periods. The riders then turned their horses and began the slow journey back across the desert. Their silhouettes grew smaller as the sun rose higher. Napoleon watched them until they were mere specks in the shimmering air. Once they were gone, he returned to the camp and gathered his officers. He relayed the details of the conversation with the same calm tone he had shown the riders. He explained that the situation remained delicate, but not urgent. He believed that the polite meeting was a sign that the opposing forces were still open to communication. This gave the French time to prepare, to strengthen their positions gently, and to deepen cooperation with the communities along the Nile. That afternoon, Napoleon visited the scholars once more. They were examining fragments of carved stone that had recently been unearthed near an abandoned settlement. The scholars greeted him with warm smiles. They explained the possible meanings of the symbols, pointing out the gentle curves of the carvings and the historical clues embedded in their shapes. Napoleon listened with genuine interest. Their work brought him a sense of grounding, reminding him that Egypt had faced countless periods of change through its long history. As evening approached, the French soldiers relaxed. Some wrote letters, others shared quiet conversations. The atmosphere of the camp felt peaceful again, though now touched by the awareness of the delicate path ahead. Napoleon spent the evening reading reports and writing instructions. His writing was slow and controlled. He described the meeting with the riders in precise detail. He outlined plans for the next gentle advancement of the army, ensuring that discipline remained central. Later that night, Napoleon stepped outside his tent. The desert sky stretched above him, filled with stars that shone with serene brightness. The air was cool and calming. He stood in silence, breathing steadily, thinking about the future of the expedition. He knew that this meeting had been only the beginning. But he also knew that the patience shown today would benefit the journey ahead. He understood that conflict often grew from misunderstanding, and that clarity could soften the hardest tensions. The desert around him felt timeless, as if reminding him that every difficult path becomes clearer when walked with steady purpose. In Part 20, we will move into the final stage of this Egyptian journey, exploring how Napoleon encounters the next wave of challenges with the same thoughtful leadership, and how these experiences shape his lasting perspective on history and responsibility. Part 20. The quiet return, reflection, soft endings, and Egypt's lasting impression on Napoleon's mind. In the final stretch of Napoleon's time in Egypt, the desert seemed to settle into a state of thoughtful stillness, mirroring the atmosphere within the French encampment. Months of gentle administrative work, careful diplomacy, patient marches, and quiet encounters with distant forces had shaped the expedition into something more than a military operation. It had become a place of learning, reflection, and cultural exchange. The men who arrived with ambitions of conquest were now leaving with memories of temples, stars, river breezes, and ancient wisdom. The early signs of a larger conflict continued to stir, but Napoleon understood that the expedition had reached a natural turning point. The French had accomplished much of what they could in this distant land. They had restored stability to villages along the Nile. They had deepened knowledge of ancient Egypt through the scholars' discoveries. They had built respectful relationships with local leaders. And they had prepared carefully for any future tensions that might unfold. But the world beyond Egypt was shifting. Quiet messages reached Napoleon with news from Europe. The political situation there had begun to change rapidly. France was entering a new phase of uncertainty and opportunity. The Directory, which had governed during his absence, seemed increasingly unstable. Influential allies urged him to return. They believed that his leadership was now needed not along the Nile, but back in Paris. Napoleon received this news with a calm heart. He took several days to reflect along the river, walking in slow paths beside the water. The Nile shimmered with its familiar serenity. Its surface remained smooth even as wind shifted over the desert. Fishermen cast nets in graceful arcs. Children played near the banks, dipping their feet in the shallows. Villagers carried baskets of figs and dates along narrow dirt paths. The sight of this peaceful life filled Napoleon with quiet appreciation. Egypt had taught him lessons he could not have learned anywhere else. He remembered the early days when the expedition first landed on the shore near Alexandria. He remembered the soft light on ancient walls, the endless dunes, and the calm voices of local elders. He remembered the scholars kneeling beside fragments of statues, treating every grain of sand as if it held a story. He remembered the quiet march into the desert when the first signs of tension appeared, and the gentle conversation with the mounted riders who came as neither enemies nor allies, but as curious observers navigating uncertainty. These memories settled in him like soft layers of understanding. Egypt had been a journey of patience, perspective, and discovery. After careful thought, Napoleon gathered his officers in the warm glow of evening. They sat in a circle around a small lantern, its flame wavering gently in the desert breeze. He explained that he would soon return to France. His tone carried calm assurance. He told them that their work in Egypt would continue in steady hands, and that their contributions had brought stability to countless families along the river. The officers listened with respect. Though surprised, they trusted his judgment. They had seen firsthand how Napoleon guided the expedition with clarity, compassion, and discipline. Before his departure, Napoleon spent several days visiting the villages along the Nile one last time. He traveled slowly, stopping to speak with elders, farmers, artisans, and local leaders. They greeted him with quiet gratitude. Many had grown accustomed to the respectful behavior of French officers and soldiers. Napoleon assured them that the structures he had put in place would remain. He emphasized that the French administration would continue its work peacefully. These farewells were gentle. Each conversation unfolded at a calm pace. Children offered him woven bracelets or small clay bowls. Elders spoke of harvests, festivals, and the hope that peace would endure in the coming seasons. Napoleon accepted their gifts with humility. He understood that these modest offerings carried deep meaning. They represented trust, respect, and the quiet human connections formed across cultural boundaries. He also visited the scholars, who had become in many ways the soul of the expedition. Their camp was filled with baskets of artifacts, carefully inked drawings, rolled parchment, and delicate instruments used to examine stones and ruins. They greeted Napoleon with warm smiles. They thanked him for giving them the opportunity to study Egypt so deeply. Many admitted that this had been the most meaningful period of their lives. Napoleon thanked them in return. He encouraged them to share their discoveries with the world, believing that knowledge was one of the most lasting gifts a leader could offer. He felt comfort knowing that the scholar's work would continue long after he left the desert. On his final night beside the Nile, Napoleon stood alone near the water's edge. The moon cast a silver glow across the landscape. The river whispered softly as it moved toward distant lands. Palm leaves swayed in the breeze. The sky stretched above him in a peaceful tapestry of stars. It was a quiet moment, free from urgency and burden. He thought about all he had learned. He had learned that leadership required patience as much as decisiveness, That diplomacy grew from listening more than speaking. That strength was not only measured in victories, but in the ability to guide others with clarity and calm intention. He had learned that ancient civilizations held lessons that extended far beyond their ruins. And he had learned that the human spirit endured in the gentle rhythms of everyday life, even in times of uncertainty. When dawn approached, he wrote one final set of instructions for the officers who would remain in Egypt. His handwriting was steady. His words were clear. He emphasized fairness, respect, and discipline. He encouraged cooperation with the Egyptian people. He reminded the officers that true leadership rested in restraint. The following day, Napoleon prepared for his departure. His ship waited quietly at the shore. Officers and soldiers gathered to bid him farewell. Many felt emotional, though they expressed it only through soft nods and steady posture. Napoleon shook hands with each officer, offering calm words of gratitude. As he boarded the ship, he took one last look at the Egyptian coastline. The desert stretched into the horizon, glowing under the sunlight. It felt timeless, unchanged by the passage of human armies. The river twisted gently through the land like a thread of life. The pyramids rose far in the distance, silhouettes shaped by countless generations. Napoleon knew that the memory of Egypt would remain with him always. As the ship sailed away, he stood on the deck and watched the coastline slowly fade into the haze. The warm wind brushed against his face. The water reflected the sky in soft blue and gold. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet movement of the sea guide him into reflection. Egypt had shaped him deeply. It had provided lessons of patience, culture, leadership, diplomacy, and history. It had shown him the beauty of a civilization older than the world he knew. It had taught him that the greatest journeys are often those that reshape the inner self. The chapter of Egypt came to an end with gentle stillness. Napoleon sailed home with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the wisdom of the Nile, the desert, and the ancient stones within him. And so, this final part of the series settles quietly, inviting the listener to rest, to breathe softly, and to drift into peaceful sleep with the awareness that even great stories can unfold with gentle rhythms and calm endings. As our quiet exploration of Napoleon's Egyptian campaign comes to a close, allow yourself to drift into the same peaceful stillness that settled over the desert at night. We have walked beside the Nile at dawn, listened to scholars uncover ancient stories, and watched Napoleon navigate uncertainty with patience and steady purpose. These moments, shaped by calm reflection and gentle discovery, remind us that history is not only made by battles or grand victories, but also by quiet choices, thoughtful leadership, and the peaceful rhythms of daily life. Thank you for joining this soft journey across warm sands, quiet riverbanks, and ancient halls. May the calm of these stories stay with you as you rest, and may the peace of the desert night guide you into deep, soothing sleep. Background historian out.